Welcome back to Hamler. Today we got the Chapter Master of the Raven Guard. Now before we get into the video, just a quick disclaimer. This video is 100% made by me. That's including the editing, the thumbnail, and the scripts. I did not use any automation tools at all to make this video. I made sure that this video adheres to the policy. And if you want to support this channel, be sure to like, comment, and subscribe. Now let's get into the video.
In the corpse light of the 41st millennium, the Raven Guard do not win wars by being seen. Across a galaxy of burning worlds and failing empires, there are armies that measure their glory in banners and parades, in set-piece engagements and roaring charges before the eyes of billions. The sons of Korax are not counted among them. The Raven Guard wage a different kind of war, one measured in missing names and vanished regiments, in strongholds that go suddenly silent and never answer the vox again. Entire campaigns tilt on the hinge of a few blades drawn in darkness. Victories are recorded as if by accident, as though the enemy simply collapsed from within. The butcher's bill is paid, as always, in human lives. The authors of that ledger rarely appear in the official histories. In that age, the enemy very often never sees the blade that cuts him. Deliverance squats beneath the Raven Spire like a chained animal, a world of rust, slag, and smoke, bound forever to the fortress. Monastery that crowns its poisoned sky. In the hollow vaults beneath that fortress, in oubliettes that have never seen natural light, boys are remade into weapons in the name of a distant, dying emperor. They come from the ash wastes and the lower habs, from the manufactoria levels of Kiavar and the punishment pits of the orbital platforms, from forgotten families and nameless bloodlines. They descend into the bowels of the Raven Spire and do not come back out again unless they wear black armor and carry the raven on their pauldron. Aethon Shaan was one more narrow face in that mass of recruits, a pale shadow among shadows, stripped of everything that might have been called a past. He stood beneath rust-eaten lumen cages with the others and listened to the dripping of distant condensation and the muted grind of stone as great doors opened and closed far above. His records would later state that he was born beneath the fortress monastery's shadow, a child of deliverance with no listed kin, no recorded ties, but those he would forge in blood and oaths. Even as a half-grown aspirant, he moved differently, slower in his reactions at first glance, but with a patience that reminded hardened sergeants of old predators waiting at the edge of dark water. When the master of trials dragged the first prisoner into the chamber, the boy watched without flinching. The man was a gang lord from the lower hab belts of Kiavar, dragged in chains, still wearing the torn finery of his broken rule. A jailer shattered his jaw with a shock maul for spitting at the ravens. Teeth sprayed across the deck. One tooth rolled and came to rest against Aethon's bare foot. He looked down at it for a heartbeat, then raised his eyes again. The Master of Trials stepped from the shadowed archway, a lean figure in ancient, scar-scored power armor. Plates painted the flat, light devouring black of the 19th Legion. His helm lenses glowed faintly crimson. The raven on his shoulder looked as though it might spread its wings at any moment and take flight into the vault's dimness. "This is filth," the master said, his voice calm, carrying without effort. "This is the rot that eats the Imperium from within. You were born in it. You crawled through it. You breathed it with every scrap of air your diseased world gave you. You will learn to cut it away." The prisoner was hoisted on chain hooks, driven through his shoulders, left hanging and swaying, blood dripping in slow rhythm to patter onto the steel. The serfs stepped back. The aspirants watched. Some tried to keep their gazes fixed straight ahead as they had been drilled. Some could not. The master's lenses found Aethon. "You," he said. "Step forward. Name." "Aethon Shaan. Born of deliverance. No recorded family. No debt but that which you will owe to the Emperor and to Korax. You will demonstrate if that is sufficient." A servitor rolled forward, its flesh long ago ruined, its limbs replaced with mechadendrites ending in blades and syringes. One arm extended, presenting a long combat knife that might once have been ceremonial, its surface etched with faint, worn script. Aethon took it. The weight settled into his hand as though it belonged there. "Cut away the rot," the Master of Trials said. The gang lord tried to speak around the ruin of his jaw, issuing only a bubbling, wet sound. Blood dribbled down his bare chest. His eyes rolled, struggling to focus, finding the boy below him. There was fear there, but there was also disbelief. This was a man who had strangled and beaten and burned others in dark corners of the hive, and never been touched. He had not yet understood that down here, beneath the Ravenspire, his life had already been withdrawn from him like a credit signed away on some distant administratum slate. Aethon stepped closer. He did not shout. He did not hesitate. He climbed the chains, boots braced against slick flesh, his fingers finding iron and bone, hauling himself up until he was level with the man's ribs. The gang lord tried to thrash. The chains clinked. Aethon placed the point of the blade beneath the left breast and drove it in hard and upward. There was resistance, then a hot, sickening give. He felt the shudder run through the hanging body as the heart ruptured. Blood washed over his hand, hot and thick, seeping into his sleeve. He twisted the knife to be certain, just as he had been taught in anatomy drills. The carcass sagged on its hooks. The eyes went glassy. The breath stopped. Aethon dropped back to the deck, knees bending to absorb the impact. He straightened, the knife held point down, blood dripping to form a dark pattern of dots on the steel between his bare feet. His heart was still beating fast from exertion, but his face was as still as the stone. The Master of Trials watched him for a long moment. "Efficient," the officer said at last. "You did not look away. You did not delay. Remember that. Mercy is for those who stand far from the front lines." Some of the other boys flinched. One vomited. Aethon turned his head slightly, taking them in, and then returned his gaze to the hanging corpse. There was no triumph in him, no horror either, only a sensation like a lock turning inside his chest, one tumbler after another falling into place. This, then, was the shape of his existence. The universe was a diseased thing. His hands would hold the knife. The years that followed laid steel over that understanding. Implant by implant, organ by organ, the gene seed of Corax took root in him. His muscles were unmade and remade. His bones became iron-hard under layers of ceramite and synth flesh. His world shrank to the confines of the Ravenspire's training halls and kill chambers, then expanded again, in a different way, to encompass simulation theaters and Auspex feeds that showed wars fought across 100 worlds. He learned the lexicon of death in 3 languages, and then in the silent, universal dialect of violence. As a neophyte of the 10th Company, he learned to disappear. The scout armor was lighter, his black carapace plate still new and strange against his skin, but the camellia-lined cloak that hung from his shoulders turned him into a ripple where there should be none, a darker patch of shadow in already deep gloom. He moved through the Hab slums beneath deliverance with others of his kind, their footfalls as soft as ash. His eyes picked out details that human senses would have missed, the flicker of a concealed picked lens in a vent, the subtle stiffness in a man's posture that marked a concealed weapon beneath his ragged coat, the faint, sour smell of incense burned to gods the ecclesiarchy did not name. The gang wars of Kiavar and the lower hives had always been brutal, but in those years something else moved among them. Voices in forgotten corners spoke the names of entities that were not meant to be given tongue. Crude sigils appeared, daubed in blood and promethium soot on the undersides of transport platforms and the interiors of abandoned manufactoria, their curves and spirals wrong in ways that made mortal eyes ache. Men who had once been merely cruel or desperate began to move with strange, jerky confidence, as though a puppeteer had taken hold of their strings. The Raven Guard charted this growth and let it spread. This was their way. An infection that is cut too soon leaves roots behind. Better to let it grow bold, to believe itself safe, to gather followers and allies and reach its tendrils as far as it dares. Only when every tendril has been mapped, every contact noted, every hidden meeting place and ritual chamber marked on the chapter's secret charts, is the knife finally drawn. Aethon's first operation as a full scout was against one such infection. The gang hive they were sent into had been allowed to fester for years. Its leaders had grown fat on chemtrade and weapon, smuggling, and now they spoke of liberation from the distant emperor, of powers older and kinder than the corpse on the golden throne. They had started to meet in closed chambers, where the air turned thick and wrong, and shadows moved without cause. The 10th Company dropped into that hive in the dead time between shift bells, coming down through maintenance shafts and disused transit lines. Their cloaks rippled as their Auspex units whispered silent distances in their ears. Each scout carried a suppressed bolter and a long knife. The orders were simple and absolute. No survivors, no witnesses, no trace. The first man Aethon killed that night died across the width of a breath. The sentry sat slumped on an overturned drum, an old auto rifle across his lap, his gaze fixed on the glowing tip of a El-Ho stick. He blinked once as a shadow fell across him. A hand closed over his mouth from behind, fingers like iron. A blade slid in under his jaw and angled up. Warmth spilled down his chest. The light went out of his eyes before he could register fear. 2 more died the same way within heartbeats. One had time to see his killer's reflection in a shard of broken mirror. A pale face, eyes dark, lips pressed in a thin line, the raven wing of a cloak flickering behind him. Then the knife punched into the base of his skull, and sensation dropped away for him forever. Within the hive, the cult was in full, obscene celebration. Men in stained robes daubed spirals of blood on naked chests. A half-drunk preacher with a voice ruined by screaming tried to shout a litany over the pounding of drums and the clatter of bottles. Someone had dragged an imperial Aquila banner down and turned it upside down on the wall, its black eyes stabbed out. The Raven Guard moved through them like an absence. Flickering lumen strips strobed the chamber, making moving shapes of the shadows. Every time the lights flared, the crowd seemed a fraction smaller. A drink spilled where a man had been, standing. A robe hung empty on a rusted hook, swaying gently. A cultist turned to share a joke with a comrade and found only air and the faint smell of oil. Panic came too late. By the time the first true scream was raised, most of the gang's leadership were already inert meat in the dark. Bolts whispered from the wings, each shot punching a fist-sized hole through skull or chest, the muffled report lost under the pounding drums. Knives flashed in the stuttering light. Men clutched at opened throats, fingers slipping in their own blood. Some tried to run. They found exits that had been silenced with monofilament snares or collapsing gantries. Aethon walked through it all with the same cold focus he had shown as a boy, with a knife in the oubliette. A cultist lunged toward him, hands outstretched, eyes wide with a mix of hate and manic faith. The scout fired once. The bolt round took the man in the sternum. For an instant, his upper torso was intact. Then the explosive core detonated, and his spine and ribs tore themselves apart in a fountain of gore. Aethon stepped through the spray without breaking stride. They found a squad of planetary defense troops penned in a side chamber, stripped of their weapons and chained as an offering for some obscene rite. Most were dead. A few still drawn breath, their eyes fever bright, strange symbols scored into their skin with knives and brand irons. One raised his head as the black armored figures stepped through the archway. "Throne," the man croaked. "You have to help us. They made us say things. I can still hear them whispering. Emperor, please, They are still in my head. A scout beside Aethon took an involuntary half-step forward, as though to cut the man's chains. Aethon raised a hand, stopping him. He looked into the prisoner's eyes. There was no innocence there. Behind the terror, something else pulsed and writhed, a glimmer of wrong color at the edge of perception. "Do you still hear their voices?" Aethon asked. The man nodded frantically, tears cutting pale tracks through the grime on his cheeks. "Then the corruption is already rooted. You are a breach, a door the enemy may use again." The prisoner's mouth opened to protest, to plead, to beg for some mitigation. Aethon shot him through the forehead. The sound of the suppressed bolt was a dull cough. The back of the man's skull disintegrated in a wet burst, brain and bone splashing the wall behind him. The scout who had stepped forward stared at the corpse. "They were Imperial," he said softly. "They were compromised," Aethon replied. "Would you prefer to hunt them again when the whispers tell them to open a gate in the middle of a regiment? Would you prefer to see a hab block of loyal citizens turned inside out because we were weak here?" He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. The other scout lowered his head in acquiescence. Somewhere behind them, another cultist died gurgling as a combat. Knife opened his throat. The operation was done before dawn. The gang hive died in the dark. Its thousands of inhabitants bled out in their bunks, at their dice games, in the arms of their addicted brothers. The bodies were piled high in their own meeting hall and burned. Official records would later state that a chem-still explosion had consumed the enclave. No mention would be made of black armored figures moving among the flames, watching until the last corrupted corpse had collapsed into ash. There were officers among the Raven Guard who still spoke, in private, of liberation, who entertained the conceit that they were freeing the oppressed, that their blades cut the chains that bound humanity to tyrants. Aethon saw the same prisoners, the same gang lords, the same broken soldiers, and recognized only threats delayed and threats removed. Mercy, to his mind, lay in brevity. A swift death, a clean shot, no chance for the warp to find purchase in a wounded soul. It was that quality, as much as his prowess, that saw him raised in time to the assault formations of the 8th Company. Here, his patience was married to sudden violence. Grav shoots dug into his shoulders. Jump-pack turbines shrieked as he fell from the sky. He learned to descend from storm clouds and smoke as a fragment of night in motion, chainswords and lightning claws tearing through enemy command cadres before the foe fully understood what had befallen them. Where the 10th Company taught him to erase threats quietly, the 8th showed him how to break an army's spine so that it collapsed under its own weight. On one battlefield that never made it into the official chronicles, traitor militia and renegade guard regiments had dug themselves into a defense network around a captured macro cannon. The Imperium could have shelled the position into glass at the cost of destroying the gun and the city that surrounded it. Instead, the Raven Guard was sent. Aethon watched from a ragged cloud, bank as the enemy lines flexed and shuddered under the weight of the Loyalist advance. He saw the way the traitor commanders fed reserves into the wrong sectors, trying to shore up collapsing flanks while leaving their artillery exposed. He marked the tunnels along which they moved shells and command staff, between bunkers. He let it all play out for precious minutes, letting the enemy believe that they were holding. Then he voxed a single word and fell. His squad punched through the roof of a hardened bunker in a rain of shattered ferrocrete, landing amidst a command cadre of men in stolen uniforms. Bolters roared, heads burst apart, limbs flew. Aethon's chainsword hacked down through an officer's raised arm, then bit into the man's skull. Blood sprayed across auspex screens and tactical hololiths. He did not stop to speak. There were no shouted litanies, no taunts, no theatrical declarations. There was only the work. By the time the Loyalist infantry reached the bunker network, the defenders were already broken. Officers lay dismembered in their own vox pits. Fire plans had been burned or shredded. The macro cannon's loading crews hung from their own loading chains. Intestines pooled on the deck. The gun fell silent, not because its barrel had been destroyed, but because everyone who knew how to aim it had died without a sound. Through such operations, through 100 unrecorded nights on a dozen unnamed worlds, Aethon Shaan's methods hardened. There was no relish in it, no savoring of agony, no theatricality of terror for its own sake. He did not string bodies from the walls to frighten survivors. When he left a corpse displayed, it was because someone needed to read a particular message in that placement, because fear would delay a counterattack by a critical hour or turn a cautious commander into a reckless one. Where the Night Lords reveled in cruelty as an art, in the spectacle of suffering, Aethon treated cruelty as a tool, a blade among many, to be used when effective and wiped clean when finished. That difference marked the path he would take when he was finally drawn into the veteran ranks of the 4th Company. By then, his reputation had spread quietly through the chapter. Captains began to forward particular mission profiles to his masters, cult infestations that had already claimed guard regiments, rogue psychers with a talent for escape, traitor officers whose deaths needed to look like accidents. Time and again, the same decision was made. Send Shaan. He will do what needs to be done. He will not ask for banners or songs after. His first major strike as part of the 4th was against a manufactorum complex on a distant, overworked forge world that had turned its output to arming a human warlord in open rebellion. Intelligence suggested that a single nascent psyker in the warlord's employ had begun to manifest abilities dangerous enough to twist the course of the war. The psyker had to die, and the manner of his death had to discourage any successor. The manufactorum was wrapped in defensive rings of hab blocks, worker barracks and refugee camps. Tunnels honeycombed the rock beneath, connecting everything to everything, a warren of escape routes and smuggling paths. A lesser commander might have tried to cut the psyker out carefully, minimizing collateral loss. Shaan walked the tunnels in his mind as he studied the data feeds and saw only points of failure. He gave his orders without heat. Entire belts of hab structures were quietly sealed under cover of a loyalist artillery barrage. Bulkhead doors that had not closed in decades groaned and shuddered as servitor crews forced them down. Venting valves were locked. Fire suppression systems were overridden. Alarm klaxons were disabled. When the Raven Guard kill teams infiltrated the manufactorum, killing the inner guards and placing charges around the psyker's sanctum, they did so in an atmosphere that was already turning stale. Men began to cough in their bunks and on the assembly lines. Children sucked in air that seemed a little thinner with each breath and wept without knowing why. Above them, a black-armored warrior with a raven on his pauldron watched Auspex readings and waited until the appropriate concentration levels were reached. Only then did he vox the command to detonate. The blast that tore through the psyker's lair was almost an afterthought compared to the suffocation that followed. Fire ate the remaining oxygen. Smoke choked the corridors. The sealed hab belts became mass graves, their inhabitants dying without ever knowing the shape of the enemy's face. The warlord's army lost a promising weapon and its most zealous followers in the same night. The rebellion faltered. Loyalist forces pushed in over the bodies. Later, a junior officer of the guard tried to protest the scale of the collateral deaths. The man had seen the casualty projections. He had watched the numbers climb as the population in the sealed zones suffocated and burned. He spoke of oaths to protect the Emperor's subjects, of the value of every loyal soul. Aethon listened. Then he told the man, in the same calm tone he had used in the oubliette vaults as a boy, how many more would have died if the psyker had reached full potential? How many regiments burned out from within? How many worlds left open to the predations of the warp? The numbers were abstractions, but they were heavy ones. "We cut away the rot," he said. "We do not rejoice in it. We do not avert our gaze. We do not pretend the patient does not bleed, but we cut, or we watch the body die screaming." That was the creed that grew around him, not shouted in chapel halls, not carved into stone, but passed in murmured acknowledgements between sergeants and captains. He became the blade sent to the uglier tasks, the name attached to sealed orders that no one else wanted to read. When a situation demanded not simply victory, but victory without witnesses, Aethon Shaan's designation appeared on the deployment manifests. Long before he bore any formal title, he wore the responsibilities of a shadow captain. He led small, deniable teams into fires no one else wanted to touch. He made decisions measured in millions of lives with the same unflinching pragmatism he had shown with one man hanging on hooks beneath the Ravenspire. Beyond deliverance, the galaxy burned. Hive fleets swallowed worlds whole. Orc empires rose like mold blooms in the dark between the stars. Chaos warbands hammered at the crumbling bastions of the Imperium. In such a universe, the difference between 1 billion dead and 2 billion dead was not mercy. It was mathematics. Someone had to choose which millions lived long enough to die later. Aethon Shaan accepted that task without seeking absolution for it. In the quiet hours between deployments, standing alone on a high gantry within the Ravenspire, watching the void through armored glass, he put words to the thing he had always known. "We are not saviors," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, lost beneath the distant thunder of gun batteries and the ceaseless hum of the fortress. "We are the knife. We cut away what will kill mankind today, so that it may die of something else tomorrow." By the closing years of the 41st millennium, Ultramar bled. The Bloodborne came out of the dark like a plague of blades, traitor fleets and demon-haunted hulls sweeping across the borders of the realm of Guilliman. Worlds that had known order for uncounted generations suddenly drowned in blood and fire. Guard regiments raised from a dozen sectors marched and died in their millions on soil that had never before known the tread of an invader. Cultist hordes boiled up from the underhives and manufactoria, their bodies offered as fuel for the ruinous powers. Orbital defense grids that had stood untested for centuries burned out under the hammer blows of warsmiths and heretic admirals. In that storm of massed slaughter, entire worlds were marked to live or die on the basis of how long they could delay the enemy. The Raven Guard were not sent to save worlds. On a dark stretch of the Void Edge, where the blue light of Ultramar's star washed weakly across the flanks of the Ravenspire's warships, a single strike cruiser altered course. Its hull was a sliver of night among the stars. Its heat signature bled away into the void. Within, in a strategium lit by hololithic projections of burning systems and shifting threat runes, Aethon Shaan listened as the Master of Shadows gave him his orders. By then, he wore the rank of Shadow Captain of the 4th Company. The honorifics meant little to him. What mattered were the parameters. A line of text, cool and absolute, hung on the air between them. Arderic Vanes, once a Raven Guard, once a brother in black, now a renegade in the service of Honso of the Iron Warriors, counted among the Bloodborne's chosen, a living scar across the chapter's honor. Intelligence suggested that Varnes had been sighted in the Warsmith's retinue, moving with him between battlefields as Ultramar burned. "Retrieve him," the Master of Shadows said. His voice was as quiet as it had been in the oubliettes, but now the weight behind it was that of an entire chapter. If retrieval proves impossible, end him. His gene seed will be taken either way. Shaan inclined his head. "Fleets are burning for Macraga, for Talasar, for Kalth," the Master continued. "Guard armies are being signed away to die on worlds whose names no one will remember. We send you and a single squad into the same storm for one man. Do you understand the priority, Aethon?" "I do," Shaan replied. "The Bloodborne are a cancer. Varnes is a splinter of that cancer in our own flesh. We remove him, or we accept that infection spreads. The Master watched him for a heartbeat through the dim glow of the hololith. "You will have no battle group," he said. "No reserve, no reinforcement. Ultramar is not our domain, and her sons have their own wars to fight. You will move as a shadow beneath their banners." "That is how we have always moved," Shaan said. The strike cruiser slid through the shoals of war toward Macraga, running dark, every emission masked or bled into the stellar noise. Around it, the greater battle swirled and howled. Warp storms boiled. Astropathic choirs screamed as messages burned their minds out. Vox traffic choked the channels with pleas for aid and curt, doomed acknowledgements. Through that din, the Raven Guard vessel was a silent thread, following trajectories mapped in the secret records of the chapter's hidden librarians. The fortress of Hera loomed above Macragge like a stone god, its walls bearing the scars of wars older than many imperial histories. Its void shields flickered fitfully in the red light of damage runes, but it still stood, still bastioned, one of the few coherent command nexuses left in Ultramar. Fleets burned in orbit. Defense monitors fought and died alongside battered strike cruisers bearing the Aquila. The Raven Guard came in beneath the main flight paths of the Ultramarines' own Thunderhawks, slipping into a blind spot in the fortress's sensor net. They were announced by nothing more than a faint disturbance on a single Auspex screen deep within the Bastion's heart, a ripple that a lesser man would have dismissed as interference. Sergeant Tellian of the Ultramarines, veteran of more wars than most men had years, frowned at the ghost trace and adjusted his controls. The blip was gone. Above him, gun decks roared as fortress batteries hurled fire into the void. Behind him, tacticians argued over casualty projections and resupply charts. He narrowed his attention, filtering out the background noise. "Something?" an officer asked. "A shadow," Tillian murmured. "Nothing I can put a bead on." By the time he turned to look at the door, there were already black-armored giants standing inside the chamber. They had come through the service corridors between the fortress's lungs, vaulting access shafts and slipping past half-seen patrols in paths mapped from diagrams copied out centuries before. Their presence pressed on the air like an absence, like the void given temporary form. The one at their head stepped forward, helm lenses dim, raven sigil dull against his shoulder. "Shadow Captain Aethon Shaan," he said by way of introduction. "4th Company, Raven Guard." Tellian's hand had already half raised toward the holstered bolt pistol at his hip. He lowered it with deliberate care. "I did not hear you approach," he said. "You were not meant to," Shaan replied. His voice carried no rebuke, only statement. "We are here at the request of your chapter master. There is a matter that concerns the sons of Corax. We will not interfere with your prosecution of the wider war." Tellian's gaze flicked over the other Raven Guard. He counted them, noting the lean lines of their armor, the slight variations in mark and plate that spoke of long years of campaigning. A single squad, where he might have expected at least a company. "You came into this," he said, jerking his chin toward the tactical displays that showed Ultramar's burning worlds, with so few. "We require no more," Shaan said. "Our objective is narrow, Ardaric Varnes." Recognition flickered in Tillian's eyes, followed by a brief tension in his jaw. "That one fell far," he said. "And you would risk this for him?" Shaan's gaze did not leave the hololith. "We do not risk this for him," he said. "We risk it because our blood sits in the warband of a traitor warsmith. The bloodborne are fire. We are here to retrieve a spark before it births another blaze." From Macraga, they went to Tarentus. The world had once been a quiet jewel in the Ultramarines' crown, its continents rich with farmland, and its cities poised between order and prosperity. Now its skies were streaked with the contrails of descending drop pods and burning wreckage. The heretic armies that followed Honso had torn a swathe across its surface, leaving charred husks where townships had stood, and littering the fields with bodies and tracked wrecks. In the heart of that devastation lay Axum, a metropolis turned abattoir. The warsmith had claimed it as a demonstration piece, a locus of spectacle. Here, the Bloodborne had crucified loyalist officers on their own bastion walls, their guts trailing in the wind as banners. Here, corrupted artillery crews shelled refugee columns for sport. Here, cornet berserkers stalked through tower blocks, knee-deep in the dead, roaring challenges to any who still clung to life. The Ultramarines would take Axum back. They had to. Its loss was a wound in their honor, a brand on the realm of Guilliman. They must do it visibly, with companies deployed, banners unfurled, voxnets carrying their oaths. That was their nature, and the nature of the Imperium's fixation on visible courage. The Raven Guard went in first. Shaan and his squad dropped far from the main spearheads, cutting into the city through waste conduits and maintenance tunnels no one had walked in living memory. The air was a soup of promethium fumes and rot stink. The echoes of distant screaming rolled down the stone like a storm. They moved in total silence, no shouted orders, no click of vox channels opened unnecessarily. Their warplate ghosted their footfalls, absorbing the sound. They passed within arm's reach of heretic sentries who never knew. A chaos gunner turned to spit over the parapet of a makeshift barricade and died with a garrote wire biting into his throat, a hand clamped over his mouth to catch the gurgle. Each kill was precise. Sentries vanished, dragged into alcoves, their bodies folded and stacked behind broken machinery. Vox relays were opened and their cables severed, their housings packed with melter charges that would detonate when the main assault came, turning the defenders' attempts at coordination into a series of confused, dying screams. In one sector, Shaan found an entire platoon of press-ganged militia lounging among the ruins of an administratum block, their weapons propped against shattered desks, their attention fixed on a crude pict feed showing pits where prisoners were being torn apart by chained demons. He watched them for a length of time that a human commander might have spent weighing mercy. Then he told his squad to cut the power. The building's lumen strips flickered and died. The crude pict stuttered, then froze. Some of the militia cursed and slapped the side of the device. Others reached for their lamps. The Raven Guard came in through the windows and the holes in the walls. Knives and short-barreled bolters whispered in the dark. Men died in heaps, throats opened, chests cored out, eyes stabbed until the brain behind them became pulp. The survivors tried to rally, firing into the gloom. Every muzzle flash gave them away for a heartbeat. Every heartbeat was enough for a black-clad figure to step in, kill, and vanish again. By the time the Ultramarines crashed into that sector in full strength, the barricades were unmanned, the heavy weapons unmanned, the Vox posts silent. Tactical squads moved from cover to cover, bolters ready, expecting ambushes. They found only dead men and the occasional sign of a carefully placed charge where a heavy stubber nest should have been. Their advance was not so much contested as guided, the resistance here, heavy there, funneling them inexorably toward objectives chosen by another mind. Shaan treated the city not as a battlefield, but as a body on a slab. Power stations were severed like ligaments. Hospitals that had become charnel houses, filled with the infected and the half-corrupted, were put to the torch or quietly vented into vacuum through breaches in the integrity of their hab domes. Refugee columns were redirected with falsified orders, turned down streets that the Raven Guard had already cleared of snipers and artillery observers, used as moving cover for kill teams slipping in their wake. Some of his own warriors balked at that. "One stray shell, and those people die in the crossfire," a sergeant said quietly, as they watched a column of grim-faced, dirt-smeared civilians shuffle past underneath a shattered transit arch. "They will die whatever we do," Shaan answered. "Here, at least, their deaths served to put bolts into the right skulls. He did not say it with scorn. There was no contempt in him for those who still flinched from that calculus. There was simply no space left in his mind for equations that did not balance in blood. The trap at Axum revealed itself only when the Ultramarines had committed fully. Honshu had never intended to defend the city to the last. The Bloodborne style was brutalism as theatre. They took what they wished from a world, then broke it in such a way as to leave a scar on the psyche of anyone who survived. In Axum, the Warsmith had seeded the underhives and sewer levels with charges attached to unstable promethium reserves and volatile munitions. The longer the battle raged, the closer the whole metropolis edged to becoming a single, vast detonation. As the Raven Guard fell back toward the extraction point, they saw the signs. Subtle tremors underfoot, not linked to artillery. Plumes of dust rising in regular patterns from the substructure. Vox fragments intercepted from enemy units, talking about the show and the end. Shaan did not waste time with deliberation. He voxed a simple encoded warning to the Ultramarines command net and ordered his own squad to disengage entirely. They moved through streets still filled with scattered firefights, killing only when they had to. Friendly icons flickered on their Auspex displays, representing blue-armored warriors still deep in the killing grounds. Shaan did not divert to gather them. That was not his remit. He had his own dead to consider, and his own objective still unfulfilled. At the extraction site, a Thunderhawk gunship crouched amid rubble, engines screaming as dust storms rolled across the landing zone. The vessel's hull was already scarred, its shields flickering as small arms fire and heavier weapons probed at its perimeter. A squad of Ultramarines fought a stubborn rear guard to keep a corridor open. Shaan and his warriors were almost at the ramp when the first Cornete Berserker broke through. The traitor came out of the smoke with chain axe raised, armor the color of clotted blood, helm wrought in the shape of a snarling demon's skull. He crashed into the flank of the Loyalist line, sending ceramite and blood flying, then bounded up the ramp with a bellow that was more animal than speech. His axe bit into the deck plates, chewing sparks, as he raised it again to hack into the nearest Raven Guard. Shaan did not alter his pace. He stepped inside the swing, letting the shrieking teeth pass a hand's breadth from his chest, then brought his blade around in a clean, economical arc. The edge sheared through corrupted ceramite and the thick neck beneath it. The berserker's head spun away, trailing black, pressurized blood. The body took 2 staggering steps and collapsed, thick arterial spray pattering against the gunship's interior. The shadow captain shook the gore from his sword with a brief snap of his wrist and turned to look back at the city as the ramp began to rise. Behind them, Axum was starting to die. Whole districts buckled as charges went off in their foundations. Great plumes of fire roared up through subway grills and maintenance hatches, turning streets into rivers of screaming, burning bodies. Towers toppled one after another, shedding glass and ferrocrete and human figures into the smoke-choked air. Somewhere amid that chaos, Ardaric Varnes and the Warsmith who commanded him were withdrawing, slipping through pre-prepared tunnels and drop points like maggots retreating deeper into a carcass. Shaan watched until the Thunderhawk's hull cut off the view. On the flight back to orbit, amidst the thrum of engines and the distant growl of thunder from the burning world below, he reviewed the mission data. No trace of Vaenes in Axum, no confirmed visual. Intercepts suggested that the renegade Raven Guard had been present earlier in the campaign, leading Reaver squads in raids that had torn the hearts out of Loyalist positions. That absence was a datum in itself. He would have to be found elsewhere. Calth, perhaps, or one of the Void battles to come. The orders regarding him remained clear. Take him alive if possible. Return him to the Ravenspire in chains. Strip his memories from his flesh. Make of his death a lesson for every neophyte who thought treachery a path to significance. If it proved impossible, kill him cleanly. Destroy the body thoroughly enough that only the gene seed could be recovered. No spectacle, no drawn-out torment. Execution, not vengeance. Raven Guard did not indulge in the blood-drunk theatrics of some chapters. They did not flay their fallen brothers or chain their corpses to tanks as grisly trophies. If one of their own turned, he ceased to be brother in all but the most practical sense. He became a problem to be solved, a threat profile to be neutralized. Here, the shadow of Corax lay long. The Primarch of the 19th had never fully escaped Istvan. The betrayal on that blackened world, the massacre of his legion, the desperate experiments that had followed, these had marked him as surely as any brand. Corax had tried to breed a new army in haste and guilt, had poisoned his gene line with faulty clones and malformed horrors. He had killed those mistakes, himself, one by one, before he vanished back into the wars of the Imperium. The Raven Guard carried his shame like an echo in their gene seed. To hunt one of their own was to repeat that act on a different scale. Many in the chapter felt that weight. They saw Varnes not just as a traitor, but as a reminder of their own potential to fail. They spoke in private of the tragedy of it, of the sorrow in turning bolt guns on a face that might as easily have worn their livery still. Shaan allowed himself no such indulgence. He recognized the history. He understood the symbolism. He filed both away as context. When he thought of Varnes, he thought of vectors and casualties, and the psychological effect on the chapter if the renegade was allowed to go unpunished. Forgiveness had no place in those equations. Neither did hatred. Hatred clouds judgment as surely as pity. In his mind, Ardaric Varnes was already a corpse. The only variables were the timing and the method. The Thunderhawk docked with an orbiting warship while Axum tore itself apart beneath them. Through an armor-glass viewport, Shaan watched the city's death throes. Great rivers of fire flowed where streets had been. Hive spires toppled like felled trees. The upper atmosphere boiled with burning debris. Vox channels carried only fragmented screams and the static roar of collapsing infrastructure. Billions had lived on Tarentus. There was no way to calculate in the moment how many had died in Axum alone, how many more would starve or burn as the wider war rolled on. The scale of it would have broken a mortal mind. For Aethon Shaan, it was a number in a ledger. He turned from the viewport, the faint reflection of his helm fading as the light shifted. For what Honso sought to unleash through that place, he said, more to himself than to the warrior standing nearby. This is an acceptable payment. He did not mean that the dead deserved their fate. He did not mean that any of it was just. He meant only that the ledger balanced. The warsmith had tried to turn Axum into a blade driven into the heart of Ultramar's morale, a spectacle of slaughter that would echo through the realms of man. Instead, the city had devoured itself in a rage too hurried to leave a clean legend. The Bloodborne's showpiece had become a chaotic blur of destruction that the Imperium's own storytellers could shape into something else. Shaan filed away what he had seen of Honso's methods, the preference for visible cataclysm, the reliance on elaborate traps and staged atrocities, the desire to be witnessed. It was vanity of a kind, a flaw. The real war for Calth and for Ultramar would not be fought in open parade grounds beneath banners. It would be fought in the guts of ships, in command bunkers and underhive tunnels, in the blind spots of sensor nets and the quiet spaces between Vox transmissions. Warsmiths who craved spectacle could be made to dance on strings woven from their own appetites. As the Raven Guard strike cruiser altered course toward the next embattled world, Aethon Shaan was already planning how to cut those strings, one by one, no matter how many worlds burned to pay for each stroke of the knife. Calth had known fire before. In the age of betrayal, it had burned beneath the guns of traitor legions and the wrath of the warp. Its surface riven and its underworld turned into a labyrinth of darkness and ash. In time, the sons of Gilliman had reclaimed it, layering new order over old scars, raising memorials and temples to the courage of those who had held the line when the galaxy itself seemed to tilt toward madness. Now it burned again. Iron Warriors' siege fleets hung in the void above the world like a forest of knives. Their guns had smashed the orbital defenses into ragged fragments, leaving only a few bastions and the most stubborn of defense platforms still fighting. Demon vessels prowled among the debris, warp light oozing from their hulls. Corrupted Mechanicus vessels spat lances of sickly energy into the atmosphere, seeding ruin from pole to pole. On the ground, billions of citizens crammed into shelters, dug into ancient rock, or huddled in the half-remembered caves of the old underworld. They clung to whatever faith they could muster as the sky glowed red and orange with constant bombardment. Vox nets choked with sobbing pleas, with administratum orders issued in shaking voices, with liturgies screamed by priests in voices that broke and bled. The Ultramarines fought across 100 fronts. Armor columns clashed with demon engines in the scarred plains outside the great cities. Tactical squads staged counter-assaults in streets that had been named for heroes and were now choked with rubble and the dead. Librarians walked the line between reality and the warp, holding back tides of unreality with wills forged in the crucible of 1,000 battles. Within that storm, the Raven Guard came to Calth like a shadow sliding behind a curtain of flame. Shaan's company had been bloodied already across the breadth of Ultramar. They had cut communications lines on Talassar, assassinated traitor commanders on Ajax, sabotaged warp ritual sites on lesser worlds, whose names meant nothing to anyone beyond their own atmosphere. Now the Master of Shadows had sent him into Calth, not simply to kill, but to measure. The 19th Legion had once fought as a massed force, a legion in more than name, their companies moving as parts of a vast predatory organism. Those days were long gone. The Raven Guard now were a chapter among chapters, their numbers a fraction of what they had once been. Yet the question lingered, in the quiet records beneath the Ravenspire, and in the minds of those who remembered older wars. Could they still think at that scale, if required? Could they still move as a knife through the heart of a war zone where another chapter held the ostensible command? The answer would be written in the blood of Calth. The 4th Company of the Ultramarines fought at the hinge points of the defense. Uriel Ventris was their captain, a warrior with a name spoken often in the chapter's own halls, for good and ill. He had defied orders, killed a tyrant, chained a demon prince, returned from exile, and reclaimed his place. The sons of Gilliman tracked such narratives carefully. They built oaths and ceremonies around them. They carved them into marble and recited them in vaulted shrines. Shaan regarded Uriel with the same cool eye he turned on any battle space. The Ultramarines captain was earnest and razor-sharp, his honor as straight as the line of his jaw. He listened to counsel, weighed it, and acted. When the Raven Guard arrived, he accepted their presence without visible resentment, though the tension in his shoulders was obvious when command reports used the words Allied support to describe what was, in truth, a test. Shaan made no effort to ease that tension. He had not come for the comfort of others. He stood with Uriel in a command redoubt, whose walls shook under the impact of distant artillery, watching hololithic renderings of the battlefield scroll past. Enemy icons glowed a malignant amber. Loyalist units were marked in blue. Entire districts of Calth's main hives were shaded gray, indicating areas where communication had been lost and casualty projections had become meaningless. "You have refugee sectors here, here, and here," Shaan said, indicating 3 stacked strata in the subterranean levels. "And the Iron Warriors have bored artillery redoubts directly beneath this one." Uriel frowned. "They are firing from under my people," he said. "That is thorough." It is their nature, Shaan replied. They are siege masters. They take the time to build a killing ground that reaches into every layer of a world. If you attack the guns directly, they will turn your own shelters into charnel pits with their counterfire. He traced a route through the Undercity. It wound through service tunnels, waste caverns, maintenance shafts that had not been logged in centuries. My kill team will infiltrate along these vectors, he said. We will reach the artillery grid. When we are in position, you will bombard this district on the surface to mask the tremors and power fluctuations. Uriel's eyes narrowed, following the route, seeing what lay above it. There are civilians in those sectors, he said. Families, workers, wounded. There are mortals everywhere on this world, Shaan replied. They are already penned in warrens and told to wait for a salvation that may never come. Every shell the Iron Warriors fire from beneath them kills loyal soldiers by the thousand. Every barrage that falls on your defensive lines opens gaps that demons will pour through. The artillery must die. If they choose to hide beneath your citizens, then your citizens are already dead in all but name. The Ultramarine's jaw tightened. We do not lightly sign away lives, he said. Nor do we, Shaan answered. We simply understand that in this age, someone must wield the scalpel. You asked for our support. This is what it looks like. It was not quite a challenge. Not quite. Uriel held his gaze for a moment longer, then gave a small nod. Do it, he said. We will cover you. The descent into the underworld of Kalth was a journey through layers of old and new fear. Shaan's kill team moved in single file along narrow corridors whose walls sweated condensation, their armor's helm lamps hooded to slivers. Above, through meters of rock and ferrocrete, millions of civilians huddled in bunkers and transit tunnels, the air thick with carbon dioxide and fear. The life support systems for those sectors were already straining under the load. It did not take much to push them toward failure. In a subsurface relay station, a pair of Raven Guard tech adepts interfaced with the mechanisms of a Hab district's lungs. Reduce flow, Shaan voxed, watching data streams crawl across his display. By half. No more. Understood, came the reply. There was the faintest hesitation before the acknowledgement, a ghost of discomfort. Then the numbers began to shift. In the shelters above, men and boys took shallower breaths without realizing it. Promethium lantern flames burned a little lower. The air tasted thicker. Voices grew hoarse, then quiet, as throats dried. Some fell asleep and did not wake. Others clutched at their chests, feeling their hearts labor. The panic that might have erupted was damped by simple lack of energy. They slumped where they sat, eyes glazing. To the auspex of the Iron Warriors, the sector's heat and atmospheric readings dimmed, becoming background noise. Not dead, just quiet. An area of lesser interest beside the glaring furnaces of armor engagements and the flaring beacons of power plants. In that artificially thin silence, the Raven Guard advanced. The artillery grid lay beneath a former mag rail exchange, its vaulted chambers reinforced with plasteel ribs and haunted by the thunder of shells being moved and loaded. Traitor gunners, their faces hidden behind masks of iron and brass, tended the massive guns with grim efficiency. The muzzles of the weapons protruded into shafts that ran up through the rock, emerging in the middle of plazas and squares above. Every time the guns spoke, buildings collapsed and men died. Sentries watched the access points, their helms marked with hazard stripes and their bolters loaded with siege breaker rounds. A few helots in dirty overalls shuffled among them, servitor control wands in hand, herding lobotomized laborers toward ammunition stacks. A shadow stepped behind one of the helots and opened his throat. The man dropped his wand and clutched at the wound, blood pumping through his fingers. Before he could hit the floor, the same hand caught him under the arm and lowered him gently into the shadow of a stack of shells. His killer vanished again. Another helot turned to check a tally slate and found the figure beside him replaced. He blinked, confusion turning to frozen horror as a black armored giant slid a long blade between his ribs. The knife punched through his lung and heart, pinning him briefly to the cogitator frame. A gauntleted hand closed over his mouth and nose, muffling his death rattle. Sentries dropped with neat round holes in the backs of their helms, suppressed bolt rounds punching through ceramite and bone and exploding inside skulls. Others died with garrote wires digging into the soft flesh beneath their gorgets. One iron warrior, more alert than his fellows, caught a glimpse of movement and managed to draw breath for a shout. His lips widened, teeth parting. A throwing knife took him through the eye, the force of the impact driving the point back into his brain. The shout became a wet hiss that ended as his knees buckled. Within minutes, the artillery grid was a killing floor. The guns stood silent, their crews reduced to torn meat sprawled across control banks and ammunition stacks. Shaan moved among them, checking each kill with the same clinical thoroughness he had learned beneath the Ravenspire. A twitch here, a lingering breath there, was answered with a swift flick of steel. Charges placed, one of his sergeants voxed. Linked for remote detonation. Good, Shaan said. Withdraw along route beta. Above them, on the surface, ultramarine artillery began to fall on the Hab sector. To the enemy, it would look like a desperate attempt to hit the guns by blasting through the civilians. In truth, it was cover for the tremors of the detonation to come, the light of the initial collapsing chambers lost in the broader curtain of destruction. The artillery grid detonated in a series of cascading explosions. The shafts that led up to the surface became chimneys for fire and shrapnel. Streets buckled and fell as the spaces beneath them turned into collapsing caverns. Blocks of shelter packed with the suffocating, half-conscious citizens of Kolth tumbled into the dark, the people within yelling for a final breath that never reached their lungs. From the point of view of the broader war, the effect was immediate. Entire swathes of loyalist lines that had been under constant bombardment suddenly found themselves free from that pressure. Advancing demon engines failed to find their usual curtain of suppressive fire. Imperial armor surged forward into the gap. Casualty projections shifted. Timelines moved. Shaan did not watch the people die. He had seen enough of that pattern to know its shape. Instead, he focused on the next piece of the puzzle. The Black Basilica moved at the heart of the Iron Warrior's assault, like a malignant organ. It was not a cathedral in the true sense. It was a conglomeration of armored platforms, war engines, and temple architecture fused into a single crawling citadel of metal and flesh. Gun emplacements studded its flanks like barnacles. Demonic iconography writhed across its hull. Shrines to the dark gods jutted from its upper levels, festooned with chains of skulls and screaming prisoners. Within its bowels, cogitator arrays and warp-linked relays processed data from 100 fronts. Here, corrupted adept Psychorin sat enthroned in a cradle of cabling and tubing, his flesh long ago given over to the laughing corruptions of the warp and the cold logic of the Iron Warrior's siege calculus. His thoughts extended along vox channels and data tethers, steering bombardments, coordinating assaults, feeding information to Honso and his lieutenants. The basilica crawled over the ruins of Kalth like a tumor, broadcasting fear and ruin wherever it passed. Its presence demoralized defenders and emboldened traitors. Its guns spat death, its auguries tracked. Every significant concentration of forces arrayed against the Iron Warriors. Shaan studied the data on it in a dimly lit bunker beneath the broken surface of the city. Uriel stood beside him, helm under one arm, face set in lines of fatigue and resolve. "If we destroy it," Uriel said, "we cut the head from their command structure." Shaan nodded. "It will not halt the Iron Warriors entirely," he said. "They are too methodical. They will have contingencies, but it will disrupt them. It will give you breathing room." "Then we do it," Uriel said. Shaan's gaze lingered on the represented structure. Understand that the Basilica is built on the backs of your own people, he said. The servitors that feed its engines, the mortal technicians wired into its cogitators, the Praetorians press gang to form its honor guard. They are already compromised beyond recovery. When it falls, they will die screaming if they are capable of screaming any longer. Uriel's hand tightened on his helm. They have already died, he said softly. The moment they were taken and mutilated, this end was written. Let us at least make their deaths cost the enemy dearly. There was steel in his voice now that Shaan could respect. Sentiment was a liability. Clear-eyed acceptance of horror was something else. We will infiltrate during their next major bombardment, Shaan said. The Iron Warriors will have their attention fixed outward. Your 4th Company will stage an assault along this vector. Make it convincing. Make it costly. If they do not believe you are attempting a serious breach, they will not commit enough of their reserves, and the Basilica will not move to support them. Uriel met his eyes. You are asking me to spend my brothers to distract them, he said. I am asking you to accept that they will die whether we make use of their deaths or not, Shaan replied. At least this way, their blood buys something. Tangible. A little time, a little disruption. Perhaps a world. The infiltration was every bit the drawn-out horror that the data had suggested it would be. The Basilica's lower reaches were wreathed in clouds of coolant and chem fog, the air bitter with the tang of industrial lubricants and the iron taste of blood. Chains hung from vaulted ceilings, some ending in hooks that bore Flent's torsos, others suspending shrines, sensor pods, or cracked armor plates bearing symbols of defeated foes. Raven Guard materialized out of that fog like avenging shades. Silenced blades slipped between armored gorgets and up under rebreather masks. Helmets were twisted until neck bones snapped. In one corridor, a squad of Red Corsairs marched, their armor daubed in the stolen livery of their origin chapter. They moved in lockstep, bolters at the ready, eyes scanning for threat. They passed under a gantry where no one stood. Moments later, one by one, they began to die. A Marine at the rear of the column jerked as a blade punched down between his shoulder plates, severing his spine. He collapsed without a sound. His neighbor turned to see what had happened, muzzle swinging up, and a gauntleted hand reached down to close over his face. His visor imploded under the pressure, shards of plasteel and transglass driven into his eyes and brain. His skull crunched like dry bone. The column faltered. Some turned to see, others raised their weapons. The fog thickened as coolant systems vented at Shaan's command. Visibility dropped to an arm's length. Bolter rounds cracked, blindly fired, detonating against bulkheads and tearing apart the first ranks of their own line. Figures moved in the mist, black on black. Shaan dropped from the gantry in silence, landing amid them. His blade carved a crescent through the fog, severing a bolter arm at the elbow, then continuing into a helmet, shearing it half away with the head inside. He pivoted, ducking under a clumsy swing, and stabbed up into the soft join beneath another Marine's pauldron. He felt the edge grate along rib and puncture lung. Hot blood sprayed across his chest plate. The corridor became a slaughter pit. By the time the last Red Corsair realized he was alone, he was already cut from hip to shoulder, his innards slapping wetly onto the deck. Deeper within, they found ranks of servitors wired into banks of machinery, their limbs reduced to stumps, their skulls encased in metal shells. They chanted binary code in voices that had long forgotten how to form human words. When the Raven Guard placed charges among them, some twitched, but most did not react at all. Their worlds had already shrunk to the pulses of data through their remaining nerves. The approach to the central cogitation chamber was more heavily defended. Iron Warriors elites, their armor reinforced with additional plating and adorned with hazard chevrons and spikes, stood guard before adamantine doors. Heavy bolters and plasma. Guns bristled from firing slits. Auto turrets swept the corridor, tracking any movement. Shaan did not attempt to rush them. He sent 2 of his best marksmen crawling along an access crawlway that ran parallel to the corridor, their armor scraped raw by the confined passage. They emerged behind the turrets, in a cramped compartment of cables and maintenance machinery. One by one, they wired explosive charges to the targeting cogitators. At Shaan's signal, the charges detonated. The blast contained but sufficient to scramble logic engines and snap firing mechanisms. The turrets sagged in their housings, their barrels drooping. Then the Raven Guard struck, not from the front, but from the ceiling and floor both. Charges set earlier blew the deck plates upward, hurling Iron Warriors from their feet. At the same moment, other charges took the ceiling supports, dropping slabs of plasteel and steel onto the defenders. Raven Guard fell with them, riding the debris down, firing point, blank into prone torsos, driving blades into exposed joints. It was brutal, close work. Bolter rounds punched through black armor. Men died on both sides. One of Shaan's veterans lost an arm and half his chest to a plasma burst, the liquid energy turning flesh and ceramite into a molten mass that hissed on the floor. The veteran still managed to lunge forward, tackling the Iron Warrior who had shot him, both of them crashing through a railing into the abyss below. Shaan did not spare him a second glance. The charges had to be placed. The basilica had to be cut open and gutted before the Iron Warriors could reroute their command net. In the heart of the engine, they found Sikarin. He was more machine than flesh. His torso melded into a throne of pistons and cables. His skull extended into a mass of augmetic interfaces. Warp light flickered behind his hollow eyes. Tubes ran from his frame into the walls, pulsing with fluids that were not entirely chemical. His voice echoed through the chamber as a layered metallic drone, chanting calculations and data streams. He did not beg. He did not curse. He regarded the Raven Guard through lenses the color of old bruises and spoke in a tone of faint, clinical curiosity. In the end, he said, entropy reaches all systems. Shaan shot him in the head. The bolt round took Sikarin between the eyes, blowing the back of his skull and the primary logic cluster behind it into a fan of gore and sparking circuitry. The corrupted adept's body jerked once, then sagged in its cradle. The biocables connecting him to the basilica's core shuddered, then began to writhe like severed serpents. "Set the main charges," Shaan voxed. "Anchor them to the primary support girders and the cogitator stacks. When they fire, I want this entire structure to fold in on itself. Many of the servitors are linked directly to the machine spirit," a tech adept warned. "Their termination will cause a cascade of pain." Responses. "Then let their pain carry a message into whatever mockery of the warp still listens to this engine," Shaan replied. "We are beyond mercy now." They withdrew the way they had come, leaving behind a web of explosives woven into the basilica's bones. The timers ticked down in silent unanimity. On the surface, as the Iron Warriors tightened their encircling fist around loyalist positions, the Black Basilica slowed. Its guns faltered as command instructions stuttered. The crawling citadel shuddered once, as though struck by some invisible fist. Then it imploded. The charges took the supporting struts out from beneath the central mass. Levels buckled and slid, crushing servitors and traitor priests alike. Warp flames belched from ruptured shrines. Gun decks tore themselves free and tumbled, firing wildly as they fell. The whole structure sagged, then slumped onto its own lower levels, crushing the screaming, wired-in populations that had fed its appetites. From a distance, it looked as though a vast, corrupt heart had finally clenched in on itself and burst. The fighting around the tomb of Remus Ventanus was no less vicious. The Iron Warriors coveted symbols as much as they did victories. To desecrate the resting place of one of Kalth's ancient heroes, the man who had first held the line in the Age of Betrayal, would have been a coup of demoralization, worth more than any number of tactical gains. Honshu had directed elite forces toward the Memorial District, with a clear intent to tear down statues and shatter sarcophagi. Uriel Ventris would not permit it, nor, for his own reasons, would Aethon Shaan. The fighting there was blade to blade. Iron warriors terminators advanced in lines, their armor bearing the Star of Chaos beside ancient hazard stripes. Heavy weapons spat death. Ultramarines met them in a clash of blue and iron, chainswords screeching, power fists crackling. The ground around the tomb became a slurry of broken stone, blood, and shattered ceramite. Shaan's Raven Guard fought in the gaps, striking where the lines wavered, murdering squad leaders and standard bearers. One by one, Marines who had once marched beneath Honso's banner fell to blades they never saw until it was too late. Each kill chipped away at the Iron Warriors' momentum. They paid for every step. 2 of Shaan's veterans died holding a breach, where a demon engine had punched through the Ultramarines' line, its many-limbed bulk writhing, mouths in its flanks vomiting gouts of warp fire. They leapt onto its hide, plunging crack grenades into open wounds, clinging as the creature thrashed and howled. When the charges detonated, it came apart in a storm of black ichor and fleshy shrapnel. The blast flayed the skin from their bones. Their armor turned into shards of scrap. Shaan noted their deaths and the gain of ground their sacrifice had bought. He did not pause to mourn. There would be time later, if he chose to. Spend it to record their names in the chapter's data vaults. The tomb was held. The Iron Warriors were forced to fall back, their attempt at symbolic desecration denied. In the wider war, it was a small thing. In the ledger of hearts and legends that the Imperium relied upon to keep men fighting, it mattered far more. When the last shots faded and the last enemy banners burned, Calth lived, scarred, bled, and haunted, but alive. The victory celebration in the shrine of Guilliman was as solemn as the Ultramarines ever permitted themselves to be. Statues towered over ranks of blue-armored warriors standing at attention. Candles burned in their thousands. Chaplains intoned litanies of gratitude and remembrance. The names of the fallen were read aloud in an endless roll, each one a note in a dirge that might have gone on for days if fully spoken. Shaan stood at the rear of the assembly, one of the few non-Ultramarines present. His armor was marked with fresh rents and dried blood. The raven on his shoulder seemed a smudge of darkness against all the marble and gold. The eyes of the statues did not shift to regard him. The words of the litanies did not change to include his name or that of his company. The celebration was not for him. That was as it should be. The Raven Guard did not fight for place in tales. They fought so that such tales could be told at all. He watched Uriel Ventris kneel before the statue of his Primarch, watched the way the Ultramarines' captain's shoulders bowed under the weight of command and loss. Later, when the shrine had emptied somewhat, Uriel sought Shaan out in a side chamber where votive fires guttered low. Arderic Varnes is dead, he said without preamble. He died defending the tomb against Honso's assault. He fought with courage and skill. When the end came, he stood at my side. Shaan regarded him for a long moment. His gene seed? He asked. Recovered, Uriel said. Preserved. I would have it. Return to your chapter. Whatever else he became, he began as a son of Corax. It seems fitting that some part of him goes home. Shaan nodded once. We will take it, he said. We will mark the manner of his death in our records. Let that be the only kindness we grant him. No monument, no statue, just the truth, in a place where only we will read it. Uriel's mouth quirked in something that might have been the ghost of a smile. Sometimes that is more mercy than most of us receive, he said. Later, aboard his own vessel, looking down at the wounded sphere of Calth, through a viewing port streaked with the residue of atmospheric entry, Aethon Shaan weighed the balances again. The world was saved for now. Its cities lay in ruins. Its population was shattered. The number of dead would be counted in billions once the dust settled, and even that would be an approximation at best. The Iron Warriors had been denied their grandest trophies, their command basilica, their desecration of Remus Ventanus's tomb. The Bloodborne as a whole had suffered a grievous wound. One renegade Raven Guard had died in a manner that might, by some lights, be called redemption. His gene seed would go back to the Ravenspire. His name would be entered in a ledger somewhere deep beneath the fortress, with a brief notation of his final stand. On the scale of the Imperium, such things were dust, and yet they were the only measures that mattered to those who still chose to do arithmetic in a universe drunk on its own ruin. The Raven Guard had always understood that victory in this age was less about saving lives than about choosing where life was allowed to linger a little longer. They would let 1 billion souls die in darkness, unmarked and unmourned, if by doing so they prevented 10 times that number from ever knowing the touch of a demon's hand or the whisper of the warp in their ears. Someone had to make those choices, to close bunker vents and sever life. Support, to plant charges in the hearts of engines built on enslaved flesh. To aim the knife not just at throats, but at entire populations, and to accept the scream that followed as the price of holding the line for a few more centuries. As Calth turned slowly beneath the hull of his ship, its wounded continents catching the light of its sun, Aethon Shaan rested his palm against the armor glass and spoke quietly, more to himself than to any listening spirit. "This is what we are for," he said, "not to keep you from the fire, but to decide how slowly you burn." Deliverance turned beneath the Ravenspire like a wounded animal learning, slowly and painfully, how to bare its teeth. Years had passed since Calth and the burning of Ultramar. Aethon Shaan had returned from that theatre with scars carved into his armor and a ledger of dead that would never be fully tallied, and the Master of Shadows had watched him make his calculations with the same cold care, whether he held one life in his hands or 1 billion. When the previous Lord of Deliverance fell, it was not debate or ceremony that raised Shaan into his place as captain of the First Company. It was recognition. The title was older than the chapter. In the days when Korak still walked among his sons, the Lord of Deliverance was the one who watched over the homeworld, who ensured that the fortress and the forges did not fall prey to the rot that spread so easily among lesser men. In this late age, it meant more. It meant that the informational arteries of the chapter, the hidden arteries of shipping, tithing, manpower, and lies, all ran across his desk. Shaan took the burden in silence. He wore the Raven of the First on his shoulder, and the honorific around his throat like another chain of office. In the strategium vaults of the Ravenspire, hololithic displays showed the traffic of entire sectors. Each icon was a ship, a regiment, a tithed consignment of ore or grain, a data stream. Each could be redirected, turned into bait, or cut off entirely. The Raven Guard had always spoken of shadow war. Over centuries, they had refined that notion into doctrine. Under Shaan, that doctrine hardened into something sharper. The trifold paths of shadow had existed as theory since the earliest days of the Legion. Veterans whispered of them in the barracks. Chaplains worked references into their sermons, but few had ever truly walked all three. Ambush was the most obvious. Strike from concealment. Cut at the enemy's tendons and artery points. Let him bleed out while he still wonders where the blow came from. Stealth was more than simply quiet footsteps and camo cloaks. It was the ability to erase one's presence from the story entirely. To strike in such a way that historians later spoke only of inexplicable failure and providential fortune, never suspecting a guiding hand. Vigilance was the rarest and the most easily neglected. It was the discipline of constant watching, of seeing threats before they fully coalesced, of mapping not only the enemy's movements, but the flows of morale, of faith, of hunger and anger among the masses of humanity. It was to understand that the battlefield began in the words of agitators and the whispers of data cults, weeks and years before the first shot was fired. Past lords had leaned heavily into the first path. Corvin Severax had turned the chapter into a blade of sudden strikes and vanished forces, his ambush so perfect that allies often arrived only after the killing was done. Aethon Shaan, for all his brilliance, had followed a similar instinct, his legend built on lightning strikes and raids so audacious that even the stolid administratum clerks could not help but write them down. Shaan looked at those legacies with respect, but he did not seek to copy them. In the hidden libraries beneath the Ravenspire, there were scrolls and holorecords few ever saw, detailing the rite of shadow known as Sprakvis. In the archaic dialect of the Legion, it meant something between speaking falsehood and speaking truth through masks. It was a meditation on realities and lies, on how information could be shaped, layered, and weaponized, until a man no longer knew whether what he saw before him was genuine or an echo of a fiction someone else desired him to inhabit. The rite demanded that its practitioner always remember one thing, that every plan was a story told to others, and that stories could be edited. Shaan studied Sprakvis as fervently as any chaplain pored over a relic. He took the trifold paths and bound them through that lens. Ambush became not only physical attack, but the sudden revelation of a carefully hidden truth. Stealth became the art of constructing false narratives so complete that an entire sector could dance upon their strings. Vigilance became the constant grinding work of sifting every rumor, every corrupted data packet, every stray vox fragment for the seeds of cancer. In him, for the first time in long centuries, all three paths were walked together. He proved this first on Deliverance itself. The data cult grew like mold in the seams of the lower hive. It began as a handful of scrap code enthusiasts, workers in machine halls and refinery stacks, who stole moments between shifts to pore over forbidden fragments of ancient logic routines. They met in forgotten maintenance alcoves, whispering about purity of code and the falsehoods of flesh. They shared symbol strings and cipher keys. They felt clever. They felt special. Somewhere a raven's skull turned its lenses in their direction. Under Shaan's direction, servo skulls and reconditioned info thralls spread through the underhives, their auspex arrays tuned not to obvious heresy, but to patterns of movement and communication that did not fit the usual curves of crime and desperation. Data streams were intercepted on their way to and from the cult's nascent altars. Names were logged, faces captured in grainy picts. Meeting places marked on the chapter's secret schematics, rooms outlined in ghostly red. He did not move against them at once. The doctrine of the Raven Guard taught that an infection cuts cleaner when its boundaries are known. The cult was allowed to recruit. Its members placed themselves in key positions within manufactoria and hab blocks. They built encrypted networks, encrypted, that is, to their own primitive satisfaction. Shaan let them think they were unseen. Then he began, selectively, to lie. Through hijacked vox channels and corrupted cogitator outputs, he fed them false confirmations. Entirely fictitious cells appeared in distant hives, seemingly reporting to the same encrypted frequencies, flushed with tales of victories that had never occurred. A shipment of machine parts was liberated by a cult cell that did not exist, the crates actually rerouted by the chapter's own logistics. A supposed magos in another system sent them praise and instructions in binaric cant, his words in truth, the product of a scribe servitor chained forever to a cogitator bank deep beneath the Ravenspire. The cult's leaders swelled with importance. They believed themselves part of a far greater network than actually existed. They took bolder risks, exposing more of their real membership as they tried to meet invented demands. All the while, the walls around them closed. Shaan had bulkhead doors inspected by chapter serfs. He had life support ducts repaired by tech adepts whose loyalty lay entirely with the Raven. He ensured that when the time came, entire sections of the Underhive could be sealed off with a handful of coded commands. On the night he chose, the cult held a great gathering in a cavernous sump hall beneath a derelict transit interchange. Hundreds of men and boys packed the space, their faces lit by flickering hollow icons and the harsh glow of jury-rigged data slates. The air throbbed with machine chant and whispered mantras. Their leaders paced a makeshift dais, promising that the machine above had recognized their efforts, that ascension was at hand. It was, in a way. In the control spire of the Raven Spire, Aethon Shaan watched the life signs of that whole district as glowing sigils on a holodisplay. Each spark was a beating heart, each cluster a family, a gang, a work crew. The cult's signature burned bright in the middle of it all, a knot of heat and noise. He gave the word. Bulkheads thudded shut across access tunnels and transit shafts. Lumen strips flickered once, twice, and died. Air recyclers sputtered to a halt. In the sump hall, the cultists barely noticed at first. They thought it a minor power fluctuation. Another hiccup in an already failing infrastructure. They talked louder, chanted louder, as though their voices could fill the growing vacuum. Minutes stretched. Breath grew hard to draw. The air turned hot and thin. Panic began at the edges of the crowd and crawled inward. Some pounded on sealed doors, their fists leaving bloody smears. Others fell to their knees and gibbered prayers at dead metal. They died in the dark, without ever knowing that every distant ally who had fed their pride was a fiction written for them by the very hand that now closed around their throats. In the records of the planetary authorities, the incident was listed as an infrastructure failure, a regrettable loss of life in a lower hive sector already marked for eventual reclamation, an accident in the grand calculus of the Imperium's negligence. In the chapter's hidden archives, it had another label, demonstration of the right of shadow, deliverance. Shaan did not stop there. If deliverance was to survive the closing years of the 41st millennium, it could no longer be merely a recruitment world and forge. It had to become a weapon in its own right. Under his guidance, grand-scale defense drills were instituted that rumbled through the planet, like constant, distant thunder. Entire regiments of serfs and planetary defense troopers marched and countermarched across wastelands and into fabricated war zones, their movements choreographed not for their own survival, but for the ease with which they could draw an enemy's eye. There were whole formations whose purpose, written in ink only the Lord of Deliverance and the Master of Shadows ever saw, was to die loudly. They practiced it with grim diligence. They drilled charges in the open, learning how to make their attacks look clumsy and desperate. They learned how to throw themselves against simulated fortified positions in ways that would flatter an attacker's pride and draw him into prepared kill zones, never knowing that the real kill would fall elsewhere entirely, delivered by raven-clad warriors slipping past in the confusion. To most of them, these were simply orders. To some of the officer class, the pattern was clear. Yet even they, seeing only part of the design, could not grasp its full cruelty. These men had been raised in the faith that dying for the Emperor was the highest honor. Shaan saw in them a more willful ignorance, a refusal to understand that their deaths were not just sacrifice, but bait. He ensured that as many as possible went to their graves, never realizing that distinction. To orchestrate such a web of deception required eyes and ears in every corner of the world. In the vaults beneath the fortress monastery, there were machines older than the Imperium's current form, relics of the age of technology, and darker times besides. Some had been used sparingly by previous lords, others sealed away by masters uncomfortable with their implications. Shaan had them brought back into the light. Servo automata, each no larger than a man's torso, rolled out into the corridors of Deliverance's administrative spires on whispering treads, their sensor arrays sweeping constantly. Info thralls, once men, now little more than shaven. Heads and spinal cords in nutrient jars were slaved to cogitators and set to watching endless streams of vox traffic and data chatter, flagging anomalies with inhuman patience. Vox relays, once merely conduits for orders and reports, became listening posts. Tiny auger spikes were hidden in shrine alcoves, drinking in confessions and drunken boasts alike. Picked lenses were set into the eyes of statues in mustering halls and barracks, recording comings and goings in unblinking silence. By degrees, the web expanded until it seemed that there was no conversation on Deliverance that could not, if he deemed it necessary, be replayed on a screen in Aethon Shaan's private strategium. There is a line in the annals of the Inquisition about the necessity of knowing the sins of men so that they might be judged. The Lord of Deliverance knew it well. He stepped over it without hesitation. The first significant test of that surveillance came when the traitor was discovered. He was not a grand figure, not a spy master, nor a cult leader. He was a human logistics officer in the broader support structure of the chapter's war machine, responsible for routing shipments of munitions and grain between Deliverance and its dependent outposts. His face was so ordinary that picked recordings seemed to slide off him when viewed, the eye seeking more interesting subjects. Yet he had taken bribes from a rogue trader with divided loyalties, and in exchange for luxuries and off-world favors, he had allowed manifests to be falsified, routes to be altered. A few crates lost here, a few redirected there. Nothing that would immediately cripple a campaign, but enough to open quiet channels through which sensitive information could have bled. The web caught him. Shaan did not order his arrest in the usual way. There was no public march in chains, no formal accusation before an imperial tribunal. That would have sent a message of its own and risked exposing how closely he watched his own people. Instead, the man simply failed to arrive at his station one shift. His colleagues assumed he had been reassigned. His family, such as it was, received a notification that he had been transferred to off-world duties. Administratum records updated themselves with the calm, inexorable authority of the machine. In truth, he awoke in a surgical theatre somewhere deep below the Ravenspire, his wrists and ankles bound in padded restraints, the smell of antiseptic and hot metal strong in his nostrils. Figures moved around him in the gloom, their faces hidden by rebreather masks and surgical hoods. One of them was an Astartes in black armor, his helm off, his eyes utterly without warmth. "You siphoned from our veins," Aethon Shaan said. "You let outsiders taste the blood we spill so carefully. You did not ask to whom it would go next. You did not care." The man tried to protest, tried to plead. He raised the usual words: ignorance, necessity, fear. Shaan listened until he recognized every lie for what it was, not out of pity, but to map the patterns of such self-deception for use later. "You will not be executed," Shaan said. "You are not worthy of the finality." What followed was, in some respects, worse than death. The man's memories were stripped from him layer by layer, the procedures refined over centuries by the chapter's apothecaries and tech adepts. Everything that made him an individual, that gave his fears and greed context, was peeled away. What remained was a functioning brainstem, a biological processor. They wired that wet, beating component into a cogitator bank in one of the surveillance hubs. His stripped mind would now spend the rest of its existence sorting data, flagging anomalies, and serving the very network he had tried to compromise. He would have no thoughts beyond the ones the machine permitted, no dreams, no ambitions, no self, just the endless flow of numbers and whispered words. Somewhere in that grey mass, perhaps, a spark of awareness remained. It did not matter. Its suffering, if it experienced suffering at all, was not the point. The point was that any who contemplated similar corruption would find this fate waiting in the quiet stories that spread through the lower strata. One more shadow in the already dark myth of the Raven Guard. It is at this turn that many chroniclers pause and invoke Corax. The Primarch had been by any measure a liberator. He had raised the oppressed of deliverance against their masters, had fought to free slaves and topple tyrants. Even in war, he had preferred clean strikes that cut out the heart of oppression, rather than indiscriminate devastation. After Istvan, he had been marked by a guilt so deep that it drove him to reckless experiments and, later, to self-exile. He had killed his own creations when they proved flawed, and in so doing, he had broken something essential in himself. The 19th Legion had carried that sensibility into the Imperium's long wars. They saw themselves, when they permitted themselves to see at all, as liberators who worked in darkness so that others might live in light. Shaan did not. He honored Corax as Gene Father and tactical savant. He respected the legend of Deliverance's uprising, but he did not share the Primarch's guilt. To him, the atrocities of the past were context, not chains. The horror of Istvan was a datum like any other. The slaughter of a rebellious population was no different, morally, from the suffocation of a data cult under Hive. Both were necessary acts in wars that would never, ever end. He did not look away from what he ordered. He did not pretend that he was a savior. Results were the only currency left in a galaxy consuming itself. Under such a man, the chapter shifted. Strike forces became more autonomous, less tied to the formal hierarchies of company and squad. It was no longer unusual for a handful of Raven Guard under a sergeant's banner to vanish into a war zone and fight a campaign entirely their own, emerging weeks later with an enemy commander dead and an entire front quietly stabilized. Records in other Imperial archives began to note, with growing frequency, that the sons of Corax had been present in theater without ever appearing in picts or cogitator logs. Commanders complained, sometimes in private missives, that they had never even seen the Raven Guard who supposedly saved their flanks. The chapter's heraldry appeared less on banners and more on fragments of shrapnel or the broken armor of executed traitors. Glory became increasingly something the Raven Guard outsourced to others. They provided the kills. They let others claim the legends. The living experiment of Deliverance's defense culminated in the simultaneous operation that historians of the chapter later referred to, with typical understatement, as the Three Cinders. In a minor subsector, dependent on the Ravenspire's logistical patronage, three worlds flared into unrest within a narrow span of time. On one, laborers on an agri-world rose against their overseers under the influence of agitators funded by a distant, envious noble house. On another, a weapons testing range fell prey to a chaos cult that promised its garrison liberation from obedience in exchange for blood rights and the worship of a new general rising in the warp. On the third, a mining moon's workers simply snapped under the weight of quotas and hunger, turning their tools on the administratum enforcers who had ground them down for so long. None of these uprisings, taken alone, threatened the sector. The administratum would normally have responded with slow, clumsy brutality, sending in guard regiments piecemeal, losing hundreds of thousands to protracted urban wars. Shaan saw in them an opportunity to prove a different method. He ordered the uprisings observed, not crushed. Raven Guard kill teams infiltrated each world, but their blades remained sheathed. They mapped leadership structures, supply routes, hiding places. They let the cult on the weapons range perform its first rituals, watch the warp flicker hungrily. They let the rebellious agri-workers seize control of grain silos and broadcast their manifestos. They let the miners butcher an administratum cohort and throw their bodies into the slag pits. Only when the shape of each fire was clear, when its fuel and its flow were fully understood, did he move. On a single night, timed to the same arbitrary chime of a deliverance chronometer, 3 different kinds of darkness fell. On the agri-world, assassins in black armor flowed through the manor houses and rebel encampments, killing the agitators and their noble patrons in their beds, leaving local leaders alive only long enough to witness the corpses, before they too died. Vox relays were sabotaged so that pleas for aid went unanswered. By dawn, the rebellion had no head. The workers, bewildered, found themselves faced with officers willing to grant them small, carefully calculated concessions. The fire guttered and went out. On the weapons range, the cult performed its greatest rite in a blast crater turned altar, summoning their promised general. As the warp opened like a wound, every life support system on the range and in its surrounding hab blocks failed simultaneously, sabotaged by Raven Guard tech adepts. Men, women, children, and cultists all choked together as the air turned to poison. The nascent demon found itself manifesting into a chamber full of corpses, its intended congregation already dead. Without witnesses, without a foothold of fear to anchor it, it howled once and was dragged back into the immaterium. On the mining moon, orbital guns that had never been fired in anger turned downward under the hands of loyalist crews who believed, thanks to forged orders, that they were engaging a Xenos incursion. The main rebel-held shaft complexes vanished in pillars of fire. Pressure waves raced through the tunnels, crushing lungs and snapping spines. By the time the mistake was discovered, there were no rebels left to protest. 3 worlds tumbled back toward uneasy order. 3 sparks of potential wider conflagration were stamped out before they could connect to any greater blaze. The reports that reached the wider Imperium spoke of unfortunate accidents, regrettable misunderstandings, and localized, quickly quelled unrest. In the Ravenspire, the first captain stood before a display showing 3 small pulsing lights, winking out, one after another. On a balcony above the Strategium, half concealed in shadow, Aethon Shaan watched him. Shrike had fought his entire life believing that the Raven Guard's nature lay in the strike from darkness, the sudden blow that changed everything. He had made his name leading such assaults, his image captured in countless picts, leaping with claws bared into the worst of the enemy's fire. Looking down at Aethon Shaan, he saw something else. Not the moment of impact, but the long, slow tightening of the noose. Not the dramatic liberation of a single world, but the invisible shaping of an entire subsector's fate. A knife, not simply driven into an exposed throat, but used to cut away cancers that most would never know had been growing. The Primarch had raised slaves against their masters. The Legion had once burned tyrants on the pyres of their own palaces. Those had been acts of overt revolution. In the quiet, ruthless Lord of Deliverance, Shrike saw a different kind of heir. Perhaps, he thought, Corax's true legacy was not in the uprisings and the proclamations, not in the statues and the slogans, but in the willingness to do whatever was necessary in the dark so that the Imperium, in all its rotting grandeur, could continue to stagger forward. Shaan did not look up to meet his gaze. He had already turned away from the dying lights of the 3 cinders, his mind moving on to the next set of data, the next infection to be mapped, the next artery of the Imperium's gangrenous body that would need his knife. Gelvia was not yet dead, but something had already crawled into its lungs and begun to breed. It was an old imperial world, a place of towering hive cities that punched through their own pollution into the thin, pale light above the cloud layer. Billions of workers toiled in its depths, their hands feeding assembly lines and ore crushers, their sweat and blood turned into promethium canisters and shell casings for wars they would never see. The hives were stacked encyclopedias of human misery, each level a page dense with cramped lives, each margin crowded with scribbled sins. In the crawl spaces between those pages, something alien had taken root. The Genestealer cults did not announce themselves with banners and trumpets. They spread like a disease of the blood, moving from one host to another in the shadows of habstacks and transit tunnels. The first-generation hybrids were obvious enough, if one knew where to look. Twisted things with too many limbs and the wrong kind of hunger in their eyes. Later generations could pass for men until they smiled too wide or spoke too reverently of the Star Father they awaited. On Gelvia, the infection had passed those early stages. There were whole strata of the hives, where every overseer, every gang boss, every hab warden bore the taint in his veins. Workers knelt in forgotten maintenance vaults and traced 8-pointed, wrong-angled signs in lubricating oil. Administratum clerks with third eyes hidden behind augmetic lenses revised population records to conceal entire lineages. A broodlord slept in cyst, like chambers deep beneath a manufactorum, its dreams echoing in the minds of thousands. Open war here would have drowned the subsector in blood and spores. A full uprising, the cult revealed at last in all its fanatic hunger, would have sent a psychic flare into the void. Bright enough to call a Tyrannid splinter fleet down on Gelvia and every world within reach. The Guard could have stamped the cult into paste with tanks and orbital strikes, but the flock of the star gods would have cheered as they died, knowing that their true masters would arrive to feast on the carcass of their world. The mission brief that reached Aethon Shaan was concise. Gelvia to be cleansed of Genestealer taint, with minimal loss of life, consistent with prevention of Tyrannid incursion. Enemy to be neutralized before psychic signature reaches critical mass. No open war authorized. Minimal loss of life in this context meant tens or hundreds of millions instead of the slow digestion of trillions. At the time, Shaan was still nominally a shadow captain, his formal rank lagging behind the scope of the tasks entrusted to him. A small force of Raven Guard was placed at his disposal, fewer than a standard chapter would have committed to a single fortified Prometheum depot. His fleet footprint was negligible. His orders were anything but. "Not a crusade," the Master of Shadows had said, before they parted at the docks of Deliverance. "A cull. The difference lies in who knows it happened afterwards." He came to Gelvia in silence. The strike cruiser's hull bore no heraldry visible to distant augurs. Its presence in orbit was masked among the traffic of merchant vessels and routine military patrols. Officially, it was a resupply ship, docking with orbital stations and offloading crates of munitions and ration packs. In truth, its holds carried something much more dangerous than ammunition. Servo automata rolled down its ramps into Gelvia's transit hubs in the guise of refit servitors and maintenance units. Their data spikes slid into cogitator housings without fanfare. Info thralls, their teeth filed down to nubs lest they bite through their own tongues, were led blinking into the light of down-hive data shrines and wired into place beside existing machine adepts. Their presence was justified with forged orders from distant, uncaring administratum offices. From those anchor points, the first step of the cull began. Gelvia ran on time, shift bells tolled with dreary regularity. Labor columns moved like blood through veins, leaving their hab blocks, flowing down into manufactoria and mines, returning in ragged, exhausted streams. Transit schedules were carved into the bones of men who had never known another rhythm. It was a machine made of meat and metal, and like any machine, it could be adjusted. Shaan did not alter anything at first. He watched. From the privacy of a commandeered subspire, walls lined with holodisplays and humming cogitators, he observed the patterns of the hives unspooling. Here, a cluster of workers who always chose the same chapel at the end of a shift, regardless of distance. There, a statistics clerk whose reports were always just irregular enough to deflect suspicion, always in the same sectors. A transit line that never quite met its projected throughput, despite all documented checks. He overlaid known markers of Genestealer infection, unusual coalescences of families with similar gene quirks, sudden spikes in birth rates, followed by unexplained miscarriages among those not touched. The patterns that emerged were not entire hives, but layers of them, flaws like slices of tainted meat in a loaf otherwise healthy. The first adjustments were small. A shipment of food rerouted from one hab tier to another, a labor column redirected down an alternative transit corridor due to maintenance. Little delays here, little accelerations there, none of it enough to trigger alarm in the brittle minds of the administratum functionaries charged with keeping the wheels spinning. Over weeks, unseen, the isolation began. Whole levels of the hives, those with cult-heavy demographics, found their outbound transit options gradually restricted, a few lifts taken out of service for repair. A mag rail loop shut down after a minor accident. Life support subunits reallocated, so that the air these levels breathed passed through different stacks than before. Stacks now seeded with micro-auspex nodes, listening to the cadence of prayer and conversation. The cultists, certain of their own growing power, rejoiced in their gatherings. They saw the small inconveniences as evidence that the pure were finally being separated from the rest of the herd. Their patriarchs whispered that the Starfather was drawing them closer, into a tighter embrace. None of them noticed that in the flow of data through the planet's cogitators, their sectors were being cordoned off like infected tissue awaiting the surgeon's scalpel. Shaan watched the numbers. He watched the head counts in the tainted levels climb toward the threshold the Ordo Xenos studies had identified as critical. Above that number, psychic resonance from a cult no longer needed a full fleet to respond. Even a wandering splinter, a hive vessel half-starved and crazed, might turn from its current course, drawn by the promise of a brood's song. He waited until the infection throbbed bright enough to offer a tempting spike to any tyrannid senses nearby, without yet being visible in the data of anyone who did not know precisely what to look for. Then he chose the night. On Gelvia, the hives never truly slept. But there were hours when the great machine ran in lower gear, when even the most driven overseers had learned that driving men past certain limits only produced more accidents and more wasted flesh. In those hours, under lumen strips dimmed to ration levels, men lay in their bunks and tried to ignore the wheezing of the air processors and the distant thump of machinery. At a synchronized chrono mark, known only to a handful of black-clad figures and the cogitators under their command, Aethon Shaan gave the signal. In dozens of hive sectors, atmosphere, processors cycled into modes their makers had never intended. Valves that had not moved in centuries groaned. Dampers that should have slowed flow to a trickle seized, then shuddered open. In some levels, the air was simply vented, sucked upward into the exhaust stacks, and expelled into the toxic Gelvian sky. In others, oxygen levels were bled down until they fell below the threshold necessary to sustain human life. Men woke coughing, clutching at pillows and blankets. Some staggered to doors that would not open. Others simply never woke at all, slipping from fitful dreams into silent final stillness. A few strong hearts lingered longer, pumping frantically as blood thickened and lungs clawed at thin air. Those were, in a sense, the unlucky ones. They had time to realize that something was terribly wrong, but not long enough to do anything about it. In a chapel where a Genestealer icon had been hidden behind a tattered aquila, a preacher woke to find his flock already dead around him, their faces blue and swollen. He took 3 breaths and tried to cry out to his 4-armed savior. His voice made no sound. His vision narrowed. The last thing he saw was the icon on the wall, its painted eyes staring back without comprehension. On another level, a brood of 3rd-generation hybrids gathered in a sump hall for worship and instruction. Their claws scraped against the floor as they swayed and muttered. When the air thinned, they snarled and hissed, tongues lolling, still trying to voice their litany even as their chests heaved in futile gulps. One by one they dropped, twitching. The Broodlord's psychic cry of rage and confusion reached out, seeking explanation, seeking the hand that did this. It found only a void where it had expected the unfathomable hunger of the hive. Tens of millions died in their beds, in their places of false worship, in their hovels and barracks. The cult-heavy sectors went dark. The psychic pressure on the warp lessened, not in a slow, predictable curve, but in a series of sharp plunges that any tyrannid presence might take for environmental noise rather than a signal to be followed. The cull was not complete. It could not be. Infection spreads in ways no chart can fully capture. There were still nodes of taint outside the killed zones, brood brothers and halfway-turned officers who slept in safer tiers, men who had never met their patriarch in the flesh, but whose dreams had already been seeded with its whispers. For those, the knife would have to go in by hand. The deep strikes into the patriarch's nests were the work that would stay with the men Shaan sent, long after the memory of orders and coordinates had faded. The Raven Guard descended through maintenance shafts and storm drains, cloaked in darkness so complete that even their enhanced senses struggled to pierce it. They wore rebreathers tuned for low oxygen, the better to move through the still settlings of the sectors that had already died. Their Auspex units pinged faintly as they approached areas where life still flickered. In one nest, carved into the lower levels of a disused mag rail station, the Patriarch lay sprawled across a throne made of fused bone and scrap metal, its pale bulk slick with the secretions of the brood. A ring of acolytes knelt around it, their mouths stretched wide in ecstatic rictus, their fingers tracing the contours of its talons. The first shots were almost gentle. Suppressed combi weapons coughed, their muzzles flicking in brief, precise arcs. Heads burst apart with dull pops, brains and teeth spraying across the stained stone. Thoraxes caved in as mass reactive shells detonated inside them. Clawed hands jerked and curled. Then the ravens were among them. Lightning claws flared with confined, crackling energy, casting sickly blue light over chitin and pallid flesh.
Sorry for the interruption. If you're enjoying the video, be sure to like, comment, subscribe. Now let's get back into it.
Hybrids leapt and scrambled, hissing, their extra limbs thrashing. A blade took one at the waist, severing it completely. The upper half flopped, screeching, while its legs stumbled on a few paces before collapsing in a shower of organs. Another hybrid lunged, jaws distended, and met a claw that split its skull in an instant, the blade slicing through bone and pulping brain in a wet, steaming spray. The Patriarch surged up with a roar that vibrated the very stone. Its mind lashed out, a wave of psychic force that would have shattered mortal brains. The Astartes were not mortal. Their nerves screamed, but their training held. Two were thrown back, armor screeching as they plowed furrows through the bone-crusted floor. One did not rise again. Shaan, at the forefront, moved with the kind of vicious grace that had left so many corpses on so many worlds. He ducked under one swinging talon, felt it rake furrows in the stone where his head had been a heartbeat earlier, and drove his claws up into the creature's thorax. He felt bone and alien muscle part around his gauntlets. Hot ichor, thick and stinking, rolled down his arms. The Patriarch shrieked, flailing, and he twisted, tearing vital organs from its core. As it sagged, he stepped in close and punched both sets of claws up under its jaw, sending crackling blades through its skull and into the alien brain. There was a single, convulsive spasm. Then the Patriarch hung limply, impaled, its psychic presence snuffing out like a candle. In nest after nest, across the hives of Gelvia, similar scenes played out. Bolter fire and blade work in suffocating darkness. Hybrid blood spattering rusted bulkheads. The soft, wet sound of alien bodies being opened. The stench of ichor and old sweat. In some places, the cultists had time to scream. In others, they died without ever understanding that their promised ascension had been nothing more than meat for a different kind of god. The cleanup was not merely physical. If the cull was to remain invisible, the deaths had to be rewritten as well as enacted. Administratum records are notoriously brittle in the face of reality. On Gelvia, they warped with a kind of awful ease under Shaan's hand. Death tallies were amended. Causes of death were altered. Atmospheric failures that had killed entire hab tiers became localized industrial accidents in the official reports, their true scale reduced to comfortable abstraction. Plague outbreaks that had never occurred were inserted into medical records to explain sudden drops in population. Hive collapses that had happened only in the imaginations of a few data scribes were recorded as destroying whole work gangs. Names disappeared from lists, entire bloodlines folded into statistical noise. The deceased were denied even the cold comfort of recognition. No memorials were raised. No parchment lists of honored dead were nailed to chapel doors. The men who vanished in their bunks and workshops left only the faintest traces in the cracks of bureaucracy, and even those would fade as data was compressed, archived, and eventually lost to time. This was cruelty of a different order. It is one thing to kill a man. It is another to kill the memory that he ever existed. There are those who would call what Aethon Shaan did on Gelvia genocide. They would not be wrong. He used the mechanisms of life support and law to exterminate entire sections of a population based on their infection by an alien creed. He ordered the execution of thousands of infected guardsmen and hab wardens who never raised a hand against the Imperium, simply because their genes had been tainted. He did so not in the heat of battle, not in the frenzy of a rout, but with the cold deliberation of a surgeon deciding how much healthy tissue to cut away to ensure the cancer does not return. The alternative was, in his mind, simple to quantify. Let the cult live a little longer. Let them consolidate, spread, perhaps even begin an open war that would make their psychic presence impossible to ignore. A hive fleet, perhaps even just a splinter of a splinter, turns its feelers toward the new song. It arrives. It wraps itself around Gelvia like a hungry fist. It strips the hives down to their foundations, drinks the oceans dry, grinds the bones of every man, boy, and hybrid alike into nutrient slurry. From that feast, it spawns, and the spawn go on to do the same to other worlds. Trillions die in that calculus. Quite possibly more, as the Splinter's descendants continue their work elsewhere. Against that backdrop, tens of millions on Gelvia suffocating in the dark was, if not merciful, then at least efficient. Morality in such equations becomes a matter of perspective and scale. A human mind not bred for war would insist that every life lost is a tragedy, that to kill preemptively is to damn oneself. A mind like Shaan's, forged in the oubliette vaults of the Ravenspire and tempered on Calth, sees only which pile of skulls will be higher. He chose the smaller pile. Once the patriarchs lay in pieces and their psychic screams had faded entirely, the work of sterilization began. Not every man who had knelt in a cult chapel or dreamed the wrong dreams had been in the sectors culled by life support failure. There were infected lineages scattered through the hives, men whose children and grandchildren carried the alien touch without ever having seen a hybrid in the flesh. Their blood could not be changed. Their genes could not be excised from the population with the precision of a surgeon's cut. But there were other methods. Medici procedures were altered, silently. Immunization campaigns were announced, ostensibly to counter the fictitious plagues that had been blamed for earlier deaths. The serums administered contained agents that left human tissue untouched, but rendered genestealer strains inert, burning out certain key sequences in any germline that carried them. Food shipments to certain districts were contaminated in more subtle ways. Nutrients were shifted, trace elements added that inhibited the development of alien organs in unborn hybrids. Those carrying the taint lived and worked. They simply failed generation after generation, to produce offspring who shared their dreams. The heresy ended, not with a last stand in a blazing cathedral, not with a glorious charge under banners, but with a whimper, with coughs and bewildered funerals, and a slow, quiet fading of a faith no one remembered clearly enough to mourn. When the Raven Guard left Gelvia, the official communiqué made almost no mention of them. Reports spoke of local authorities responding admirably to a series of unfortunate industrial incidents. They praised the resilience of the population. They commended the planetary defense forces for their discipline in the face of unrest. Somewhere, in a single footnote, the presence of Astartes' advisors was acknowledged in one sentence, so vague as to be meaningless. Shaan refused any attempt by other commanders to credit his forces. When an inquisitor of the Ordo Xenos sent a curt, encrypted missive expressing appreciation for the timely intervention, he filed it and did not answer. The story of Gelvia did not make its way into the epics sung by Ministorum choirs. No one carved its name into a battle honor on a banner that would hang in a cathedral. It became, instead, something more valuable to the Raven Guard. In the depths of the Raven Spire, in the sealed archives where only a handful of captains and chaplains walked, Gelvia's records were preserved in exhaustive detail: tactical schematics, atmosphere control logs, before and after population maps, transcripts of dying cult rites captured through hidden Auspex nodes. It was studied and taught as a case study in the perfect application of the trifold paths: ambush in the sudden, simultaneous closing of 100 invisible fists, stealth in the way an entire war had been waged, without the enemy ever fully realizing they were under attack, vigilance in the years of careful watching, pattern analysis, and ruthless readiness to act when the moment came. When new shadow captains took their oaths, they sat in dimly lit amphitheaters and watched Gelvia's death unfold on hololithic displays, listening as instructors broke down each decision. Some flinched. A few, secretly, wondered if lines had been crossed that could never be uncrossed. Aethon Shaan did not attend those lectures. He did not need to. The world lived in his memory quite clearly enough. On some sleepless cycle, alone in a high observation chamber, looking out over the ash-grey clouds of deliverance, he would sometimes call up an image from Gelvia's records. A cross-section of a hive tier, rendered in ghostly green, long corridors and cramped hab cells, tiny lights marking residual heat signatures that were already fading. He would imagine, for a moment, the silence that must now reign there. No footsteps, no shouted orders, no weeping, just bones, slowly losing their moisture to the dry air, stacked in bunks and piled in corners, long since stripped of flesh by the unseen, voracious vermin of the hive. The quietest deaths, he had come to understand, were often the most merciful. Those who died without understanding had at least been spared the panic and the false hope that came with seeing the noose descend, and they were undeniably the most useful when one needed to reshape the fate of worlds without leaving monuments in the rubble. "We do not need their gratitude," he murmured once, fingers resting lightly against the cold armor glass. "Only their absence, only their silence, where a tyrannid fleet might have heard them scream." The Strignith system was what siege masters dreamed of, and sane commanders dreaded. Its primary world was wrapped in chains of orbital bastions, each one a slab-sided fortress of gun batteries and armor plating. Void stations hung at the Lagrange points like iron fungi, studded with launch cradles and torpedo tubes. Below, the planet itself was a patchwork of fortress continents and trench seas, ferrocrete and adamantium dug deep into the crust. Surface scans showed layer upon layer of bunkers, firing galleries, kill zones, and buried magazines. The Iron Warriors had chosen their ground well. They had sunk their claws into Strigneth's moons and asteroids, turned mining platforms into overlapping spheres of fire, and seeded the void with minefields so dense that even servitor-guided drones struggled to find paths. Any conventional assault would have been a butcher's row of advancing ships and burning wrecks. The guard regiments mustering in the staging zones projected casualty figures in the billions over a campaign that would last decades. Encirclement and annihilation, as the doctrine said. The sons of Perturabo preferred their victories slow, methodical, and definitive. The Imperium's answer, at least on parchment, was the ever-advancing Indomitus Crusade. Fleet elements, bearing the sigil of the Crusade, translated into the system one by one, emerging from the warp in ragged formation. Some ships were fresh, hulls still bearing the gleam of recent refits. Others were scarred veterans, their armor patched in places with darker plates and their auger masts crooked from previous battles. Among them moved a Raven Guard strike cruiser, its transponder codes broadcasting exactly what they were meant to broadcast. A relief force under Crusade directive, pledged to assist in the liberation of Strigneth and the restoration of Imperial rule. Behind that veneer, the plan was something else entirely. Aethon Shaan stood in the strategium of his ship and watched hololithic displays render the enemy fortifications in pale green outlines. The bastions were not just obstacles, they were expressions of the Iron Warrior's soul. Every overlapping field of fire, every redundancy, every funneled approach spoke of their pride in their craft. Pride was as exploitable as fear. He listened in silence as data slates clattered, as mortal officers briefed him on ammunition stocks and projected losses, as astropaths relayed fragmentary orders from the higher Crusade command. Somewhere beyond the hololiths, in the real void, Navy admirals and guard generals were already drawing up plans for classic attrition. Wave after wave of ships and men grinding themselves to ruin on the bastion's guns. Shaan let them talk themselves dry. Only when the last projection had been laid out, the last hopeful arrow drawn across the map, did he speak. "We will not win this with a siege," he said. "If you try, the Iron Warriors will oblige you. They will let you feed men into their guns until there is no one left to send." An old guard general, skin like parchment stretched over bone, frowned across the table. "With respect, Lord Astartes," he said, "there is no clean approach. Their guns reach everywhere we can reasonably muster. Our duty is to pay the price and keep moving forward." Shaan's gaze rested on him for a heartbeat. "Your duty," he said, "is to follow lawful orders issued under the seal of the Adeptus Astartes and the Inquisition." A servo skull drifted down from the rafters, a small purity seal fluttering from its battered casing. The sigil hanging from it had the stylized eye and blade that even the most stubborn officer recognized. The general's jaw tightened. "The orders are simple," Shaan continued. "You will launch your assaults. You will do so visibly. You will throw your men at those bastions as though nothing in this war exists beyond the frontal attack. You will die loudly and without subtlety." Murmurs rippled around the strategium. Shaan let them run their course, then cut them off with a small gesture. "Every gun they fire at you, every firing solution they calculate, every shift in their fire plan, we will record. We will map the pattern. We will turn their love of fortifications and perfect kill zones into a noose around their necks." A younger officer, perhaps foolish enough to still believe in the justice of his own life, ground his teeth. "You are asking us to be bait," he said. "I am telling you that you are bait, whether you acknowledge it or not," Shaan replied. "You can be bait that buys a decisive strike, or bait that dies pointlessly in a war measured in generations. Those are your choices." Veiled inquisitorial seals carried weight that no mortal rank could easily oppose. In the end, the generals bowed, some in anger, some in resignation, a few in the numb acceptance of men who had seen enough of the Imperium to know that this was how it worked. On the appointed day, the surface war of Strigneth began. Armored columns rolled forward across cratered plains toward bastion walls. Super-heavy tanks crawled through minefields under skies, stitched by contrails and lasfire. Men advanced in waves, lasguns held tight, choking on propellant and promethium fumes. Artillery roared behind them, shells arcing toward the Iron Warriors' emplacements. The enemy responded as expected. Bastion guns that had been quiet flared to life, spitting macro shells and plasma lances. Enfilading fire raked the advancing troops from angles they had not anticipated, cutting neat lanes through formations that became windrows of bodies. Thermobaric charges turned the air itself into a weapon, igniting entire companies in single rippling detonations. Mortar pits, hidden until now, began to walk barrages across the battered tanks, cracking armor and ripping tracks from chassis. From his vantage in orbit, Shaan watched it all unfold in real time. Every muzzle flash on the surface, every energy spike, every emission was captured by the arrays aboard his ship. Auspex techs, their eyes bloodshot and fingers raw from constant adjustment, translated the chaos into clean geometry, arcs of fire, blind spots, overlapping, zones. The Iron Warriors were careful, but they were also proud. They brought more guns to bear than strictly necessary, eager to annihilate the attackers in perfect order. On the surface, men died by the 100,000, their bodies reduced to anonymous dots on casualty scattergrams. In the void, those deaths took the shape of a pattern in Aethon Shaan's mind. "Here," he said, tapping a point on the stellar chart, where a belt of orbital forts ringed the planet's equator. The bastion clusters overlap too heavily. There are angles of approach between them that offer less cumulative fire, still murderous, but survivable for a force of our size. Riva squads and Phobos armored specialists assembled in the launch bays, their armor matte black, helm lenses dimmed. They checked grav chutes and mag clamps, Auspex packs and breaching charges. Their war gear was tuned not for direct engagement, but for void work, lines and grapnels, cutting torches, low-footprint comms. They launched under cover of the larger battle. Dropcraft flared out from the Raven Guard cruiser, lost among the countless attack runs of bombers and gunships. In the clutter of Auspex returns, they were just more noise. Some did not make it through the defensive envelope, torn apart by blind flak or swatted from the sky by stray macro shells. The rest jinked and darted, using the bastion's own fire as cover. At the edges of Strigneth's defensive ring, where two bastions' fields overlapped imperfectly, matte black shapes detached from their transports and drifted toward the armor-plated hulls. Mag clamps engaged with dull thuds as they hit. Rivers in void, hardened armor clung to the bastion skins, like ticks on some vast iron beast. Cutting torches flared in small, controlled bursts. Circular sections of plating fell away into the void, tumbling silently. Through those wounds in the bastion's hides, the Raven Guard slipped. They entered in maintenance shafts and forgotten service corridors, in spaces where no self-respecting Iron Warrior would expect a foe to be. They moved through the guts of weapon stations, skirting around ammunition lifts and coolant reservoirs. Tech thralls died without ever seeing their killers, throats opened or skulls crushed against bulkheads. Shaan did not leave this partly to subordinates. On one of the central command bastions, a massive slab structure bristling with gun decks and vox spires, he led the boarding action himself. The bastion's interior was a maze of armored corridors and fortified control chambers. Iron warriors in full warplate stalked its halls, their armor bearing the hazard stripes and chevrons of their legion, their bolters loaded with siegebreaker rounds. Servo skulls and seeker drones patrolled the spaces, their lenses glowing faintly. The Raven Guard came from above. they dropped through the bastion's spine, cutting their way down from the upper sensor arrays. Shaan went first. The claws of Severax extended, their crackling blades casting feral light into the darkness. He plunged through a mesh floor and landed in a central corridor, his weight bending the plasteel. An Iron Warrior turned at the sound, his bolter already rising. Shaan slammed into him before he could fire. The claws punched through the traitor's chest plate, shredding through metal and synthetic fiber, crushing ribs and organs. Shaan felt the resistance give, felt the claws meet the spine, and then he twisted. The body tore in half, upper and lower sections flopping apart in a spray of blood and ruptured machinery. Black ichor and oil splattered the walls. Another Iron Warrior fired, the bolt shells sparking off Shaan's pauldrons and helm. He moved in a blur, closing the distance in 3 strides. His left claw raked across the muzzle of the bolter, tearing it in half and shearing fingers from the hand that held it. With his right, he took the traitor at the throat, the blades carving out a red, steaming cavity where neck and lower jaw had been. The head toppled backward, still encased in its helm, attached to nothing. They drove toward the bastion's heart. Bulkheads became obstacles, not protections. The claws of Severax carved through armored doors with the same grim ease they had opened chests. Panels fell away, glowing at the edges where the blade's energy had fused the metal. Behind each barrier, more defenders waited. Some were cut down before they could react, bodies flensed into strips that slapped wetly against the walls. Others managed to fire a few rounds, the ricochets screaming down corridors before finding flesh in friend or foe alike. At the primary Vox relay hub, a knot of Iron Warriors stood firm, their armor pitted and scarred from previous campaigns. They had read the data on the Raven Guard. They understood what it meant to face Sons of Korax in confined spaces. They dug in, weapons braced, entries covered. It did not matter. Shaan came in from above and behind, having cut through a service crawlway no one had thought to monitor. He dropped into their midst and became a storm of black ceramite and tearing light. Claws hooked beneath helmets and ripped them free, spines and throats attached. Chests were opened from sternum to hip, ribs snapped aside as though they were kindling. One traitor tried to grapple him, their armored forms locking together, ceramite grinding on ceramite. Shaan drove both claws into the Iron Warrior's abdomen and spread his arms. Gutstring and shattered armor spilled out in a torrent, slapping onto the deck. The traitor's last defiant snarl gurgled into nothing as his lungs collapsed. When the Vox cores lay exposed, pulsing with data, and lit by the steady glow of their status runes, Shaan finally slowed. "Secure the node," he ordered. "Patch through to our own cogitators. I want direct injection into their command chain." Tech adepts moved in, their mechadendrites, whispering over the enemy machinery. Code scrolled across displays as systems were probed, subverted, rewritten. Iron Warriors' voices snarled over the Vox, demanding status reports, firing solutions, explanations for inexplicable weapon lockouts. Shaan listened. He began to answer. The first falsified orders were subtle, minor adjustments to firing trajectories, slight delays in volley timings, enough to cause confusion, not suspicion. When the Bastion Masters requested cross-checks, the responses they received came through channels they trusted, in codes they believed known only to them. The Raven Guard had taken those codes apart and reassembled them with the same care they used on flesh. Then the real commands went out. Bastions along the equatorial ring received orders to reorient their guns, to target what their cogitators identified as enemy craft massing for a flanking assault. Void stations on the moons were instructed to fire on specific coordinates, supposedly designated as priority targets. The Iron Warriors, obeying what they believed to be directives from their own strategoi, turned their own fortifications against one another. Imperial Guard squadrons were in those spaces, whole armadas of human vessels, massed as sacrificial points to bait out maximum response, found themselves hammered by the guns of bastions that should have been focusing on the enemy. Cruisers buckled under sudden concentrated fire from friendly positions. Destroyers vanished in flares of plasma as macro shells found their magazines. Transports, bloated with men and material, split apart, their hulls venting bodies and burning debris into the void. On the bastions, gunners who realized too late where their rounds were falling screamed into their Vox sets. Corrections were requested, then countermanded. Some tried to disobey outright, to shut down their batteries rather than continue the slaughter. Their own masters, still trusting the corrupted command channel. More than their subordinates' panic, overrode lockouts and forced the guns to keep firing. Within the Raven Guard ship, data feeds cascaded. The hololiths showed overlapping fields of destruction as bastions tore into each other's arcs. Shaan watched bastion icons flash, flicker, and go dark as structural failure cascaded. The Iron Warriors' carefully built fortress system, meant to grind opponents into paste over years, began tearing itself apart in minutes. Guard casualty numbers climbed at a terrifying rate. Entire regiments, entire fleets were being erased, not by the enemy's hatred, but by Aethon Shaan's design. It was easy, from a certain vantage, to call this monstrous. To see the Raven Guard's strategy as indistinguishable from the cruelty of the Iron Warriors they fought. After all, both sides burned men by the million to make a point. Both used fortifications and guns and the obedient meat of soldiers to carve their mark into planets. The difference lay in intent and scale, and that difference is colder than comfort. The Iron Warriors valued the siege for its own sake. Their pride was bound up in the grind, in the slow, smug obliteration of a foe. They would have spent lives, theirs and others, simply to prove the inevitability of their methodology. A decade-long attrition campaign over Strigneth would have suited them very well. The Raven Guard valued time. They weaponized the predictability of that Iron Warrior pride by collapsing the time frame. They were willing to treat billions of Imperial soldiers as nothing more than moving Auspex pings, sacrificial markers to draw fire and reveal weaknesses, because they believed that shaving decades off a war would, in the aggregate, save more lives than it cost. The calculus is obscene, but it is at least a calculus, not a fetish. If there is cruelty in that, it is the cruelty of a surgeon who cuts deeper than the patient can imagine or consent to, on the logic that a shorter, more brutal procedure might avoid a slower, more agonizing death. By the time the night over Strigneth's primary world had cycled once, its defenses were in ruins. Assassinations had cut down key Iron Warrior commanders in their sleep, the Raven Guard having used captured ident codes to open their sanctums. Sabotage teams had blown coolant lines in plasma reactors, causing overloads that wrecked whole bastion cores. Internal betrayal, orchestrated through carefully targeted Vox messages and falsified orders, had turned some garrisons against others. Old rivalries inflamed with surgical precision. What should have been a long siege ended in a single span of darkness and screaming. The official reports that later circulated through Crusade Command summarized the Strigneth campaign as short but costly. The language was painfully familiar. It glossed over the decision to feed regiments into the bastion guns for the sake of mapping their fire. It did not mention the deliberate orders that had sent guard fleets into the crossfire of their own side's co-opted artillery. It framed the high losses as the inevitable price of cracking a fortified system. No one reading those neat, detached paragraphs would know that the cost had been inflicted by design, not necessity. In the record vaults beneath the Ravenspire, the Strigneth operation was filed under a different heading. There it sat beside Gelvia and Calth and a dozen other worlds whose names never made it into hymns. There it was, annotated in Shaan's own clipped, precise notation. Assets expended, enemy capability degraded, time frame compressed. When the last Vox echoes of the battle had faded and the fires on the surface had burned down to dull glows. Shaan took a gunship down to one of the landing zones, where an Imperial regiment had been committed in full to one of the first frontal assaults. The plain was a churned morass of mud, ash, and bone. Burned-out hulls of tanks and troop carriers lay scattered like broken toys. Torn banners, their colours blackened, sagged from snapped poles. Here and there, bodies were still visible in the wreckage, half buried, limbs twisted at angles no living joint could sustain. He walked among them without escort, helm under his arm, the wind tugging at the edge of his cloak. His boots squelched in blood-enriched soil. He paused beside the shattered remains of a command vehicle, its interior charred, the skeletons of officers still strapped into their seats, their decorations fused to their ribs. There were names painted on the hull, half melted. He read them anyway. He did not kneel. He did not offer a prayer. He did not speak to the dead as though they might be listening. Instead, he drew his slate from his belt and made a notation. Projected duration of Strigneth campaign under conventional doctrine, measured in decades. Actual duration from first assault to collapse of enemy defenses, less than a year. Estimated Imperial casualties, avoided by compressing timeline, uncountable billions. Then, after a moment, almost as an afterthought, he added a final line. The deaths here shortened the war by decades. He did not write that this made them noble. He did not flatter their sacrifice with platitudes. He did not lie to himself about what he had done. He simply recorded the arithmetic and turned back toward the waiting gunship, the wreckage of the regiment settling behind him into the silence that always followed when the guns finally, however briefly, fell quiet. Aethon Shaan had once been a dull name in the endless ledgers of the Administratum. An industrial world among thousands, its continents suffocated under hive cities and manufactoria, its oceans long since poisoned into heavy, sluggish sludge. It had no great monuments, no ancient shrines, no tales sung beyond its own choking skies. The orcs changed that. They came in rusted hulks and black iron rocks, slamming into the atmosphere like meteors, trailing fire and junk metal. They hit the hives like fists, smashing spires apart, vomiting greenskins into the streets and hab corridors. Within months, every continent crawled with them. Greenskin war engines trundled through the ruins of Manufactoria, their crude cannons roaring. Stolen tanks and treaded fortresses rolled over mounds of human dead. The sky was a permanent bruise, choked with smoke from a war that had become a kind of industry of its own. The Guard came in response, as they always did. Regiments from a dozen worlds dug lines across the ash wastes and turned hab blocks into improvised redoubts. They fought and died by the million, laser guns snapping and heavy weapons barking as waves of orcs crashed against them. The casualty charts rose into the billions, human and Xenos both, numbers so big that the minds of the men filling them in simply stopped trying to attach meaning. The orcs loved it. The great roar of their wah swelled with every battle. Every clash fed the storm. The more they fought, the more came. For them, Aethon Shaan was paradise. For the Imperium, it was a wound. Into that wound, the Raven Guard came like infection of a different sort. Aethon Shaan's strike cruiser translated into the system amid the battered hulls of Indomitus Crusade escorts and exhausted Navy vessels. Its transponders identified it as a relief force, Astartes support dispatched to stabilize a beleaguered front. Its arrival was greeted with the usual mix of awe and naked desperation from Guard officers whose worlds had shrunk to the range of their own artillery. Shaan listened to the pleas. He listened to the requests for reinforcement, the begging for an honorable visible stand alongside the black armored angels of death. He listened, and he shook his head. "We will not win this by standing shoulder to shoulder with your regiments in the trench lines," he told the assembled generals, his voice as flat and unyielding as the hololith table between them. "The orcs will oblige you in that kind of war, until none of you are left to keep the ledgers." One of the younger commanders bristled, his cheeks hollowed by weeks of poor rations, eyes red-rimmed. "With respect, Lord," he said, "we are already committed. We hold hive bastions at the cost of entire regiments. If you will not fight with us, why are you here?" "To end the war," Shaan replied, "not to share in its noise." The Wa was a beast of two hungers. Orcs needed food, ammunition, and all the crude supplies of their war machines. But more than that, they needed fighting. Without constant battle, their numbers and their momentum would flag. Their war bands would turn on each other or drift away. Shaan had no intention of feeding them either hunger for longer than necessary. His mission orders were precise. Decapitate the Wa so completely that what remained collapsed into wandering packs of feral gangs, too disorganized to threaten a world beyond. Sporadic raids. Preserve Astarte's strength wherever possible. Human lives, the orders implied without stating, were another currency entirely. The first blows he struck on Essia II did not fall on orcs at all. They fell on the world's own arteries. Agri convoys from off-world, already strained by the demands of a planetary-scale conflict, began to arrive late. A few broke apart in warp translation, their twisted wrecks appearing in the void like rusting blossoms. Others misjumped, emerging days and weeks away from their intended coordinates, their captains bewildered by astropathic waypoints that were not where they should have been. Those that did reach Essia II often found their docking permissions changed at the last minute, their cargoes redirected to depots whose records later showed no such deliveries. Food shipments went missing in the gaps between cogitator logs. Ration distributions were lost in transit between one hive and another. The administratum grumbled and stamped its seals on blame reports, none of which ever quite traced the fault back to a living, culpable man. In truth, the fault lay in the shadow of the Ravenspire, in scripts written in the Rite of Shadow, and transmitted under seals no mortal dared question. At Shaan's command, orbital traffic patterns shifted just enough to create choke points. A few orbital docks were declared unsafe and shut down. A handful of stations were quarantined for suspected plague. The net result was a gradual reduction in the flow of food and munitions into the major hives, the kind of slow constriction that could be dismissed as wartime strain right up until it reached catastrophic levels. On the surface, the guard commanders reacted as they always did when supply faltered. They tightened belts, they cut rations, they pulled troops back from non-critical sector fronts. Civilians bore the brunt. Entire districts of the hives found their food allotments halved, then halved again. Men fought over stale ration bars and grey nutrient slurry. With orc raids a constant threat, many fled deeper into the hive's hearts, seeking shelter in basements and forgotten tunnels. The greenskins noticed. They smelled the hunger on the wind. They saw fewer juicy human crowds on the streets. Their scouts reported empty squares and silent manufactoria, where once there had been constant streams of targets. The war bosses bellowed and hurled boys at the remaining bastions, eager to crack them open and dig the prey out. Those bastions, too, Shaan began to strip. He sent orders to guard generals, backed by the authority of Crusade Command and veiled inquisitorial sigils. Withdraw from this bastion. Redeploy from that hive spire to a new line. Abandon strongpoints that had been bought in blood. Some protested, their voices cracking with disbelief. "We have held St. Merovin's bastion through 3 orc assaults," one colonel raged over the vox. "You wish us to give it up now, without a fight? My men will think me craven. The orcs will think us weak." "Then let them," Shaan said. "You will fall back along the coordinates transmitted. You will leave behind enough heat signatures to appear present for a time. You will resist the urge to make a final stand. That is an order." There were muttered threats of tribunal, of refusing to be party to cowardice. They died on the lips of men who had seen the rosette before, or heard enough stories to know what it meant when Astartes spoke with inquisitorial backing. The withdrawals began. Hive spires that had been linchpins of the defense, bristling with guns and banners, suddenly ran thin. Some were ostensibly abandoned in panic, others in slow, controlled retreats. In both cases, the orcs saw the same thing: weakness. They poured into the vacated bastions, roaring, firing wildly, daubing crude glyphs over imperial iconography. They did not realize that many of the guns they now occupied had been deliberately left unfired, the ammunition stores beneath them seeded with charges. They did not wonder why certain structural supports looked untouched by battle, their surfaces oddly pristine amid the ruin. In one towering hive spire, a warboss's second in command stomped through a cathedral level, his boots leaving bloody prints on white marble, now cracked by shellfire. He beat his chest and roared to his boys, promising more fighting, more crumping, more red. Far below, in the sub-basements, remote detonators hummed. Shaan sat in the shadowed belly of his ship, gauntleted fingers resting lightly on a hololithic representation of that same spire. He waited until Auspex showed its upper tiers seething with orcs, until the broad heat signatures of their mobs had saturated every level. Now, he said, the charges went off in the hive's bones. It did not explode outward in a single blinding instant. Instead, supports failed in sequence, like vertebrae, crumbling in a giant's spine. Floors sagged, then gave way. Upper levels sheared from their moorings and slid, collapsing into lower ones. Whole hab districts fell into the guts of the spire, taking screaming greenskins and trapped humans alike into a roaring cascade of rubble and dust. Outside, guard units on the new retracted lines watched as the hive leaned, shuddered, and then tore itself apart, clouds of debris billowing out like ash tides. The thunder of its implosion rolled across the battlefield, drowning out the orcs' bellows for a few heartbeats. Within that storm, millions of Xenos died, crushed, torn, buried under thousands of tons of fallen architecture. Along with them died the last stubborn souls who had refused to abandon the bastion or who had been too slow to flee. Their deaths did not appear in any tally that mattered to Shaan. Their absence mattered. He repeated the process. Spire after spire, bastion after bastion was offered up, seemingly weakened, and then sacrificed. The orcs could not help themselves. They surged into each, banners waving, guns firing in celebration. The Raven Guard let them fill the spaces, then killed them with stone and steel. It was faster than shooting them. It was cleaner than fighting them hand to hand across every corridor. It did not lack for cruelty. By the time the orcs began to suspect a pattern, their numbers on Essia II had been reduced by vast, invisible margins. The greenskins did not count their dead as men did, but even they felt the diminishment. The constant roar of the Wa grew thinner, hoarser. Some mobs, finding no easy walls to climb or bastions to loot, drifted away, falling into squabbling packs that fought each other for scrap. The war boss at the heart of it all, however, was not yet finished. He was a monster of iron and muscle, an orc whose bulk rivaled a dreadnought's, clad in plates of stolen tank armor and festooned with trophies. Chains of skulls clattered around his shoulders. His power claw could crush a man, and his armor into paste with a single snap. His name was a roar of syllables in crude orc dialect that human tongues could not quite form. Imperial tacticians reduced it to a designation code. He rallied his remaining forces for one last push, gathering his nobs and his most vicious boys into a tide of green that rolled toward the last major bastion, still held visibly by the guard. It was a fortress cathedral, carved into the flank of a shattered mountain, its walls cracked, its towers blackened, but its guns still firing. The war boss wanted it. He wanted to mount its bells on his battle wagon and hear them clang as he rode over the last human skulls. Guard officers pleaded for Astartes' presence on the walls. They wanted black-armored figures with them as the end came. They wanted, if nothing else, to die in a way that would be remembered. Shaan did not go to the walls. He and his chosen cadre waited in the upper air, in a Thunderhawk gunship riding the turbulent currents above the battlefield. The Blackwing mantle hung from his shoulders, its dark feathers twisting in unseen winds, its sigils drawn from the recovered relic of Corvin Severax. The claws of Severax glimmered on his hands, their folded blades humming softly. Below, orcs howled and fired as they charged, their crude war engines belching smoke. The noise was a physical thing, a wall of sound and hate. They slammed into the bastion's outer defenses, climbing over each other in their eagerness. Guard heavy guns spat until their barrels burned, mowing down row after row of greenskins. But for every one that fell, 3 more clambered over his corpse. Shaan watched until the war boss himself came into view, a towering form at the heart of the tide, bellowing, his claws snapping, his boss pole hung with impaled heads. "Target confirmed," Shaan said over the Vox. "All Raven units, prepare for drop. Priority is the war boss and his nobles. Ignore the rest unless they obstruct." His warriors checked their harnesses, their jump packs, their weapons. There was no shouting, no oaths, only curt acknowledgements and the click of safeties. The Thunderhawk's ramp dropped. The Raven Guard fell. They hit like fragments of the night sky torn loose and hurled down. Jump packs flared, slowing their descent at the last instant. Shaan landed atop the back of an orc dreadnought, the impact denting its armor, then kicked off as it staggered, using the momentum to hurl himself into the densest knot of knobs around the war boss. The first orc he hit came apart almost lazily. One set of claws took the arm that held a heavy cleaver, severing it at the shoulder in a spray of dark, viscous blood. The other raked across the throat, opening it to the spine. The knob's head lolled back on sinews, his tusked mouth gurgling as he collapsed. Another swung a chain flail the size of a man's torso. Shaan stepped in under the arc, feeling the wind of its passage, and drove both sets of claws up into the orc's gut. Blades tore through layers of muscle and crude metal plating, then ripped upward, splitting the creature from pelvis to breastbone. Entrails slopped out in a steaming, coiling mass, looping over his arms and slapping onto the churned ground. He moved with the same measured efficiency he had shown in the shadowed corridors of Gelvir and the void stations of Strigneth. There was no wasted motion, no flourish. He killed to clear space, to close distance, to reach the real target. Around him his cadre did the same. Raven Guard reavers slammed into the flanks of orc mobs, combat blades punching into joints and necks, bolt carbines coughing rounds that blew limbs off at the shoulder. An orc's head vanished in a red mist as a shot with perfect placement detonated inside its skull. Another's lower jaw was sheared off by a knife, its tongue flapping grotesquely as it screamed and bled out. Over the Vox, the kill confirmations ticked in, each one delivered in the same calm, clipped tones, regardless of the gore that accompanied it. Unit Lecter, 2 knobs down, position holding. Unit Gal, heavy weapon platform neutralized, relocating. Shaan, closing on primary. The war boss noticed him. He turned, spittle and blood flying from his maw, and bellowed something that might have been a challenge in his own brutal tongue. He shoved aside one of his own knobs to get a clear swing with his power claw, the field around it crackling, the air itself screaming as it snapped. Shaan did not answer. He had no interest in meeting the greenskin on its own ground of shouted bravado. He dodged the first swing by the width of a hand, feeling the claw's field crackle across his armor's flank. A lesser man would have been pulped outright. The war boss laughed, a sound like rocks grinding together, and swung again, faster than his bulk should have allowed. Shaan went under it this time, rolling forward between the brute's legs, claws dragging along armored greaves and finding purchase where plates met. He jabbed one set of blades up and behind, feeling them punch into the hamstring of the orc's left leg. Tendons snapped. The war boss staggered, bellowing, dropping to one knee. Shaan came up on his flank. He struck at the arm that bore the power claw, slashing at the pistons and cables that fed it. Sparks flew as he severed lines and tore out crude hydraulics. The claw spasmed, snapping open and shut uncontrollably, then sagged, the field around it flickering and dying. He might have spoken then, if he had been another kind of Astartes, a boast, a condemnation, a declaration of the Emperor's judgment. Instead, he simply drove both sets of claws into the war boss's chest, sinking them up to his wrists. He felt ribs crack like dry twigs. He felt something large and hard and vital give way. The orc's breath exploded out in a gout of blood and broken teeth. For an instant, the war boss stared down at him, red-filmed eyes wide, tusked mouth working. Then Shaan ripped his arms apart. The war boss's chest split open. A flood of meat and bone fragments burst out, drenching Shaan in stinking gore. The huge body toppled backward, crushing two lesser orcs beneath its bulk. Its boss pole fell with it, banners and heads flapping, then snapped. There was a sensation, almost physical, as the Wa energy broke. The roar that had been a constant background to the battle faltered. Orcs nearby looked around in confusion, their instincts gagging on the sudden absence of their leader's presence. Some kept fighting out of sheer habit. Others began to back away, snarling, their nerve cracked in the only way an orc's could be, by seeing their biggest, loudest champion turned into opened meat. "Primary down," Shaan said over the vox. "Confirm visual on standard. All units, begin extraction as per plan. No pursuit." It went against every instinct of the guard watching from the walls below. They wanted to chase the fleeing Xenos. They wanted to press the advantage, to clean the field. They saw the orc lines faltering and tasted a victory that could be seen from their parapets. The Raven Guard did not indulge them. They killed what they had to in order to clear their own withdrawal routes, then leapt skyward, jump packs flaring, grapples hooking onto descending craft. Within minutes of the war boss's chest cavity collapsing, the Astartes were already pulling back, leaving the stunned, leaderless mobs to mill and howl among the corpses. In the weeks that followed, the orcs on Essia II did what orcs always did without a unifying presence. They fought each other. War bosses rose from the carnage and tried to claim the mantle of leadership, only to be challenged and killed. Mobs fractured and reconsolidated in different patterns, then fractured again. The great tide that had once poured toward human bastions, scattered into 1,000 smaller, meaner streams. Shaan let them. He seeded the wilderness and the ruins with beacons, small devices camouflaged as wreckage, buried in slag heaps, hidden in the gutted remains of Prometheum tanks. Each one pulsed a tight beam signal toward the void, a signature known only to his own fleet and a handful of Navy captains brought quietly into confidence. Over months, long after the main engagements had ended, those signals were answered. Navy ships in distant orbits turned their guns toward coordinates that showed no Imperial presence. Lance strikes stabbed down into ravines thick with orc camps, vaporizing them in gouts of white, cleansing fire. Cyclonic torpedoes were deployed on a scale small enough to avoid cracking the planet, but large enough to turn forests of scrap fortresses into glass-lined craters. Saturation bombardments swept across ash plains where warbands had gathered to fight each other, obliterating them without the need for a single bolter round. No Astartes were present on those fields. No black armored figures raised their weapons. The greenskins died under the gaze of ships whose crews often did not even know why they were firing at those particular patches of wasted land, only that the orders bore the right seals. By the end of the campaign, orc presence on Aethon Shaan had not vanished, but it had diminished to something akin to a persistent infestation. Feral bands roamed the wild zones, raiding occasionally, but lacking the numbers or cohesion to threaten the hives in any serious way. The guard garrisons, replenished by belated convoys, reverted to the weary routines of occupation and suppression. The stories that spread through the ranks and later into the wider Imperium told a very different tale. They spoke of a last stand at the mountain bastion, of guardsmen and Raven Guard fighting side by side atop the walls against impossible odds. They told of black armored angels dropping from the sky with war cries on their lips, their swords blazing, driving the orcs back by sheer heroism and faith. They mentioned, in passing, the necessary demolitions of compromised hives, written off as tragic but unavoidable acts of war. No one outside a small circle heard about the deliberate starvation, the arranged misjumps, the engineered building collapses that had turned entire city districts into mass graves for both orcs and humans. Those details were sealed by inquisitorial sanction, buried beneath layers of classification. To speak of them in the wrong company was to invite interrogation and memory scourging. On a parchment map hanging in a distant segmentum command hall, a scribe drew a line through Aethon Shaan's name, marking it as reclaimed. A laureate officer somewhere received a medal for coordinating joint efforts with Astartes' allies in the face of overwhelming greenskin aggression. In the Ravenspire, the file on Aethon Shaan was slotted into place beside Gelvia and Strigneth, another example of Aethon Shaan's application of the trifold paths on a planetary scale. He returned to deliverance thinner by a few more ounces of soul he did not acknowledge as lost. In a rare quiet hour, standing on a balcony overlooking the furnace glow of the hives below the fortress monastery, he found his thoughts returning to the greenskins of Aethon Shaan, to the way they had roared and rushed, never pretending to be anything but what they were. Orcs were simple. They wanted to fight. They wanted to kill. They wanted to hear the crunch of bone and the thunder of guns. They did not cloak their hunger in rhetoric or justify it with scripture. They did not lie to themselves about what they were. Their brutality was as honest as a fist. Humans, he knew, were worse. They would kill for the same reasons and then spend years weaving stories to pretend they had not. They would sell out entire worlds for convenience and then talk of duty. They would take the sacrifices he had arranged on places like Aethon Shaan and turn them into parables of courage, rather than the carefully calculated butcheries they truly were. If the galaxy was not to drown beneath the honest, bellowing green tides of orc war, then the species that summoned those tides again and again with its own incompetence had to be controlled, shepherded more harshly than any Xeno scum, fed lies and fear and carefully edited truths until they moved in the patterns someone like him could use. "We knife the beasts," Shaan murmured, watching the smoke rising from Deliverance's own manufactoria. "But we leash the herd. One without the other is useless." In that sentiment lay a logic as grim as anything the Iron Warriors had ever built, and far more insidious. By the time the great crusades of resurrection began to gutter out into a dozen grinding frontier wars, the raven on Kayvan Shrike's shoulder felt heavier than it ever had. He had worn the mantle of Chapter Master through the opening storms of the Indomitus Age, his name carried across Vox networks and scribbled into the margins of Imperial propaganda. He had stood beside Primaris heroes on gilded decks, nodded to High Lords and itinerant Lords of War, spoken in councils where whole sectors were signed away to one strategy or another. His image had become the face of the Raven Guard for men who would never see deliverance, only picked hollows and approved histories. It was necessary. It was also unsustainable. The Imperium, in its senility, craved visible champions. It needed names to place beneath the crude woodcuts and shimmering hololithic images stamped out by a million cathedral presses. Shrike had filled that need as well as any one man could. But the chapter he led had never been made for visibility. Its true work was not done in the light. It was done in the hidden chambers beneath, where no scribes were ever invited. In the quiet hours of a cycle aboard a battered strike cruiser returning to deliverance from yet another theatre left smouldering behind them, Shrike sat with Aethon Shaan in a small observation blister. Before them, the warp flickered and twisted, contained by the ship's ancient shields. Between them, on a simple stand, lay relics older than most of the chapter's living memory. The claws of Severax, their long talons folded in on themselves, power fields dormant, were mottled with the stains of battles so long past that only archivists remembered the names of those worlds. Beside them rested the Blackwing mantle, a cloak of dark feathers and synth weave, its inner lining inscribed with oaths and kill markings invisible, unless seen in certain lights. Shrike's eyes were tired. The gene seed of Korax kept his flesh from the sag that claimed lesser men, but there was a weight behind his gaze that spoke of centuries of killing. "The Imperium needs me to stand in the light," he said. "It needs a figure it can. Point 2. A recognizable silhouette against the fire. The chapter does not." Shaan said nothing. The warp flared, throwing sickly colors across their armor. "It needs something else," Shrike continued. "It needs a hand that never emerges from the shadow, a mind that does not have to explain itself to crusade councils and sector governors, a knife that answers to nothing but our own, older creed." He gestured to the relics. These belonged to Corvin Severax when he bore the title of Master of Shadows. He wielded them when he shaped our chapter into what it is now, before I took up his place in name, if not in method. There was a faint twist to Shrike's mouth at that admission. "The galaxy is worse now than it was in his day. The Imperium is weaker. The enemy is bolder. We need more than one kind of master." He looked at Shaan, and in that gaze was a weighing that had begun long before this moment. "I will remain chapter master in the eyes of the crusade, for as long as that theatre requires it," he said. "They will hear my name, see my face, put me on their rolls of honor and their endless declarations. But within the Ravenspire, within the halls that matter, another office will be recognized as the spine of our will." He spoke the title with the gravity of resurrection. Master of Shadows. Not a mere honorific. The office, the true helm of the chapter. There had been Masters of Shadows before. In the days of the Legion, the title had belonged to the officer who orchestrated the 19th's infiltration operations, who coordinated the unseen wars that ran beneath the surface of more glorious campaigns. After the breaking of the legions, it had persisted as a mark of dark prestige, a sign that the bearer was first among the shadow captains. Over time, as records were lost and priorities shifted, the meaning had blurred. Some thought of it as a ceremonial recognition of excellence in stealth, others as a role, as a separate from the chapter master, an adjutant of sorts, a spy master. Shrike intended to strip away that ambiguity. "We will not divide our intent," he said. "The Master of Shadows will be the chapter master in truth, the one who holds our doctrines, shapes our campaigns, and decides which worlds we bleed for. If I must deal with Primaris politics and crusade planning, so be it. But when the chapter asks who truly commands the Ravens, it will look to you." He reached out, picked up the claws of Severax, and held them for a moment, as though feeling the residue of their previous bearer's will. Then he extended them toward Aethon Shaan. "You are the only one among us who has walked all three paths and not flinched," Shrike said quietly. "Ambush, stealth, vigilance. You have turned them from theory into practice on a scale that most of our brothers will never fully comprehend. You have done things I might not have had the stomach to order, even knowing they were necessary." There was no accusation in that, only acknowledgement. Shaan took the claws. They were heavy, but the weight was not in the metal. It was in the expectation they carried. Corvin Severax had wielded them when he had first pulled the chapter fully into the age of Shadow War. Shrike had retrieved them from the battlefield where Severax had fallen. Now they rested on Shaan's hands, the power field sparking as they recognized a new master. He felt their blades hum against his gauntlets, the faint vibration running up into his bones. The Blackwing mantle came next, its dark spill of feathers settling across his shoulders like night itself. The inner lining's inscriptions, some written by Severax's own hand, some older still, brushed against the black of Shaan's armor. It was not a comfortable weight. It was not meant to be. "Do you accept the office?" Shrike asked, though they both knew the answer had been given long before, in the suffocating hives of Gelvia, in the collapsing spires of Asia II, in the dead air of Strigneth's void forts. "I accept," Aethon Shaan said. In that moment, the line between title and role blurred and then disappeared. The Master of Shadows was the Chapter Master. The Chapter Master was the Master of Shadows. Within the Raven Guard, the locus of authority shifted almost imperceptibly, like a tide turning beneath an unruffled surface. The Imperium at large did not notice. Its attention was fixed on the grand banners of the Indomitus Crusade, on the names its heralds shouted in vaulting cathedrals. It saw Shrike where Shrike chose to stand. It did not see the man who had just taken the real reins. Under Shaan, the transformation of the chapter accelerated. He had always thought in webs. Now he had the freedom to spin them across entire sectors. The battle companies were restructured into detachments that owed as much loyalty to operations as to formal company lines. Strike forces were given the authority to vanish into theaters for years with minimal contact, equipped with everything they needed to wage wars alone. Armories of silent weapons, libraries of encoded star charts, caches of gene-locked relics, and, more importantly, the doctrinal license to act on incomplete orders. Imperial commanders found, increasingly often, that they were not so much requesting Raven Guard support as discovering its effects after the fact. A rebellious governor's palace would be found empty, its guards dead in their armor, the man himself hanging from a data mast outside, his tongue nailed to his chest. A Chaos Warband's fleet might arrive at a staging point to find its supply depots already gutted, ammo stocks sabotaged, and key sorcerers mysteriously absent, their bodies later discovered burned to bone inside ritual circles that had been altered by unseen hands. On paper, these were separate incidents, small ripples in a greater ocean of war. In truth, they were the work of shadow detachments moving according to plans that only Aethon Shaan fully perceived. He did not sit in a single strategium and shuffle icons across hololiths. He moved like a whisper from one hidden command core to another, from the depths of the Raven Spire to astropathic sanctums aboard fleet flagships, from clandestine meetings with dour Ordo agents to encrypted transmissions that never touched unguarded air. The scale of his thinking reached its apex in a campaign whose name never made it into most chronicles. In the Bastia subsector, or some equivalent weave of worlds at the edge of the Imperium's mapped reach, reality tore itself open along several fronts at once. Tyrannid hive tendrils, their chitinous maws dripping with the slurry of consumed stars, pushed in from one flank. Chaos raiders, drawn by the scent of fear and the promise of slaughter, struck from another. Necron tomb fleets stirred beneath long, quiet systems, their dead worlds blinking into cold, pitiless light. Ordinary doctrine would have demanded piecemeal responses. Sector commanders would have tried to hold every world. Guard regiments would have been shuttled back and forth, worn down by transit and panic, flung at any crisis that screamed loudest on the Vox. Shaan saw an opportunity in the madness. He constructed, in the privacy of his own mind, and in the encrypted vaults of Raven Guard cogitators, a lattice of sacrifice. Entire regiments were ordered into offensives that he knew, to the man, would fail. They charged not to take ground, but to draw enemy formations into specific alignments that would expose command nodes and warp conduits. Orbital docks, crammed with refugees and wounded soldiers, were given false astropathic coordinates for their evacuation. They translated into unreality along paths that intersected Tyranid tendrils or Chaos ambush points, their deaths lighting up the void in ways that pulled Xenos and heretic attention away from more strategically vital zones. On one world, a corpse-cold Necron tomb began to awaken beneath a hive spire. The local command begged for Astartes' intervention to seal it. Shaan denied them. Instead, he leaked carefully constructed intelligence to a nearby Chaos warlord, whispering of ancient technology ripe for plunder. The warband descended on the world in a frenzy, clashing with the emerging Necron phalanxes in a slaughter that scoured the continent. The hive's population was annihilated in the crossfire. Shaan watched as the Chaos fleet and half the Necron vessels bled themselves white on each other. When their losses reached the point he had designated as sufficient, he signaled a Navy battle group to move in and finish the survivors. The tomb went back to sleep amidst sands fused to glass. The world was abandoned. In official records, it was marked as beyond reclamation, its loss regretted but contextualized. In his own ledger, it was simply a node removed, its sacrifice having shaped enemy expectations and movements in ways that had saved 10 others. On another world, orbital docks clustering around an ancient space elevator became overloaded with those fleeing Tyranid ground assaults. Shrines were packed, their floors slick with the sweat and tears of men praying for ships that would never arrive. Shaan could have ordered a portion of the Raven Guard fleet to divert there, to pull out a fraction of the trapped population. He ordered extermination instead. Silent beacons activated on the dock's hulls, broadcasting target designations to Navy guns that had been instructed to expect them. Lance strikes rained down, turning the crowded platforms into incandescent skeletons. The space elevator's spine snapped, its segments plummeting through the atmosphere, trailing lines of burning wreckage. Where they struck the surface, they carved deep trenches through the Tyranid biomass, vaporizing millions of Xenos organisms and poisoning the ground for future tendrils. The men and boys, who died in the wreckage, fed no prayers upward. Their bodies became part of a larger equation, one line in a sum that only their unseen killer would ever fully see. These are the kinds of decisions that do not sit comfortably in most histories. Lore about figures like Aethon Shaan tends, when it reaches the wider Imperium at all, to be scattered, fragmented, and double-filtered. First through the necessary secrecy of the chapters themselves, then through the clumsy hands of scribes and chroniclers whose remit is to inspire, not to horrify. They write of a master of shadows who exemplifies the Raven Guard's traditions of stealth and precise strike. They mention, perhaps in a single line, that he fought in the Ultramar theater, or distinguished himself in the shadow wars of the Indomitus Crusade. They list relics attached to his name. They sketch outlines. They do not talk about Gelvia, or Strigneth, or Eskia II. They do not mention the decision to suffocate millions in their sleep, or to drop hive spires onto orc mobs, or to turn entire guard armadas into bait. Those stories are buried in redacted reports and sealed data vaults. The men who might have spread them have had their memories excised or their tongues removed. What we have done here, tracing the shape of his campaigns through those hidden scars, is closer to vivisection than biography. It shows the veins and the nerves of his decisions, the blackened heart beating beneath the chapter's surface image. Aethon Shaan himself appears, in most of these operations, only at inflection points. On the Bastior fronts, the rare moments when he manifested in the flesh were at the ends of things. A Chaos warband, having fought its way through baited defenses and apparent gaps in Imperial lines, would find itself suddenly without astropathic guidance, its ships isolated. In that moment of confusion, black pods would fall from the dark between stars. Shaan would emerge from the broken shells, the blackwing mantle snapping in the rush of vented air, the claws of Severax already extended. He would move through the flagship's bridge like a verdict, cutting Vox officers in half as they turned, severing the spine of a champion of the dark gods with a single brutal slice. Gouts of enemy blood would paint the command throne as he drove his blades through the warlords seated upon it, pulverizing hearts, crushing larynxes, ripping apart the organs that anchored demon pacts. He did not stay to posture. Once the head was removed, he left the carcass to collapse on its own. On a tyrannid-infested world, he might appear only in the last stages of a defensive action, dropping into the midst of a synapse cluster, carving apart the dominant nodes, then withdrawing while the lesser creatures fell into disorganized spasms, leaving the main work of burning and bombardment to the fleets above. On the rare occasions that mortal soldiers saw him clearly, they did so from a distance, usually in the midst of carnage already decided. A black figure moving through the blaze, claws sick with alien ichor before vanishing into smoke and darkness. Their testimonies, when they survived long enough to give them, were breathless, disjointed. They interpreted what they saw through the lens of their own need for heroes. They spoke of an avenging angel, not of the quiet, ruthless man who had signed their regiment's death warrant weeks before to make this very moment possible. In the end, his creed can be articulated with the same cold clarity he applies to his warfare. Strike from shadow. Bleed the foe dry long before he realizes he is wounded. Lie, whenever necessary, about the cost. Ensure that humanity survives, even if nothing it does any longer merits that survival. There is loyalty in that, of a sort. Bent and warped, stripped of romance, but loyalty nonetheless. Not to the institutions of the Imperium, which he sees as crumbling facades, nor to the speeches of priests or the pretensions of high lords, but to the stubborn animal persistence of mankind as a species. If that species must be drugged with propaganda, herded with fear, culled and redirected and sacrificed in their millions to keep the greater predators at bay, then so be it. Someone must wield the knife. Someone must be willing to be remembered, if at all, as an outline in the dark. In a high chamber of the Ravenspire, where the outer wall is a single slab of armor glass, older than many wars, Aethon Shaan often stands alone between campaigns. Below, deliverance smolders, its hives breathing smoke into a sky that has never known true blue. Above, the void stretches in wheeling constellations. He looks out at the star field, and he does not see beauty. He sees a map of future work. Every point of light is another world that might one day have to be cut free. Another system whose hives might have to be vented, whose bastions might have to be dropped, whose people might have to be lied to and spent to shape a larger victory. The Raven Guard were born as liberators, or so the stories say. Slaves raised to topple masters under Corax's guidance. That myth still has its uses. It gives the chapter something to whisper to itself in the rare moments it seeks comfort. In Shaan's time, they have become something else as well. They are the cold surgeons of a dying Imperium, standing over a patient riddled with cancers, armed with knives that cut as much healthy flesh as tumorous. They operate knowing that the body will not live forever, that in all likelihood it will not live long at all. They cut anyway, not to save it for eternity, but to keep it staggering on for a few more bloody steps. Whatever tales the priests tell, whatever names the administratum records, that is the truth in the shadows beneath the raven's wings.